Hello everyone, today we are going to Alabama death row to see what crimes got these inmates the capital punishment and how long have they been waiting for the sentences to be carried out.
A News 19 review found the average inmate in the state is on death row for more than 16 years.
Now looking at Alabama's death row population, it currently houses 166 inmates, 161 men, 5 women, 85 white inmates, 79 black inmates, and 2 listed by the state as other races. Alabama has executed 69 people since 1983.
William Bush, 41 years on death row. He is the longest serving death row inmate in Alabama, awaiting his execution since 1982. He was sentenced for murdering Montgomery convenience store clerk Larry Dominguez in 1981 during a robbery. He is now 73 years old. Harry Nix, 39 years on death row. He was convicted in 1984 for the murder of Robert Black during a shop robbery in 1983. He is 72 years old. Earl Jerome McGahee, 37 years on death row. He was convicted for entering a nursing school classroom in September 1985 and murdering his ex-wife and another female student. He is 66 years old. Harvey Lee Windsor, 33 years on death row. He received the death penalty for robbing and shooting Randall Pepper at a gas station in 1989. He is 60 years old today. David Freeman, 33 years on death row. He was convicted on October 20, 1989 for murdering 17-year-old Mary Gordon and for essaying then murdering her mother as well. He is 54 years old. Kenneth Eugene Smith, 33 years on death row. He was charged with the murder of Elizabeth Sennett, who was found dead in her home after being stabbed 8 times in the chest and once on each side of her neck. Smith was paid $1,000 to commit this crime by the woman's husband, a preacher that hoped to collect insurance money. Smith is now 58 years old. Michael Anthony Sockwell, 33 years on death row. He was convicted of shooting and murdering Montgomery County Deputy Sheriff Isaiah Harris. The crime happened in 1988 and the wife of the victim was actually a co-defendant. Sockwell is now 61 years old. Gregory Hunt, 33 years on death row. He got the death penalty for essaying and beating his ex-girlfriend Karen Lane. He is 63 years old. Charles Randall Stewart, 33 years on death row. He was convicted in 1990 for shooting and killing his ex-wife in front of their 6-year-old son. He is 70 years old. Mark Allen Jenkins, 32 years on death row. Tammy Hoagland, a restaurant employee from Birmingham, was last seen there on April 18, 1989, and Jenkins was found guilty of her murder. Her body was discovered next to a highway. Jenkins, who has an IQ of 76, is mentally impaired and should not be executed, according to his attorneys. He is 56 years old. Charles Lee Burton, 31 years on death row. Along with another man, he was convicted of murdering Doug Battle during a robbery that they committed in 1991. He is now 68 years old. Jeffrey Day Reber, 31 years on death row. He was convicted of killing Glenda Phillips in 1990 at a convenience store. He is now 56 years old. Wayne Holman Travis, 30 years on death row. He was convicted for the murder of Clarine Haskew, a 69-year-old widow, in her home during a burglary. His co-defendant, Stephen Hall, initially got the same sentence, but later he was resentenced to life in prison. Travis is now 54 years old. Michael Shannon Taylor, 30 years on death row. Taylor was just 19 years old when he murdered Ernest and Lucille Moore, an elderly couple for which he occasionally mowed the lawn. He wanted to steal their money and car. Taylor is now 52 years old. Christopher Barber, 29 years on death row. Barber essayed, stabbed, murdered, and then set on fire the body of Thelma Bishop Roberts in her home. The next day, her 16-year-old son found her on the bedroom floor with a plastic bag over her head and a knife in her chest. Barber is now 54 years old. Jimmy Davis, 29 years on death row. Davis was convicted for the murder of Johnny Hazel during a robbery in a convenience store in 1993. He is now 53 years old. Alonzo Lydell Burgess, 29 years on death row. He was charged with the murders of his girlfriend Sheila Nodimol, who was 31 years old, and her two daughters, Latoria Long, 14 years old, and Alexis Nodimal, 8 years old. There was proof that he used the carjack's portion to beat the victims. Burgess is now 57 years old. David Lee Roberts, 29 years on death row. He was convicted for murdering Anitra Jones during a robbery in 1992. She was the wife of the man that gave shelter to Roberts. Roberts is now 57 years old. Casey McWhorter, 29 years on death row. Edward Lee Williams Sr. was attacked and killed by Casey McWhorter and two juvenile accomplices, one of whom was the victim's son, before they robbed the house. McWhorter is now 49 years old. Robin Myers, 29 years on death row. He was convicted of murdering Ludie Mae Tucker and injuring a guest that she had in a home invasion in 1991. He is now 62 years old.
My name is Mae Puckett, and I was a juror on the capital murder case for Rocky Myers. I felt like at any time I could hear that pivoting moment that would help me make a decision one way or another, and it didn't come. The DA never presented us with a strong case saying that Rocky Myers killed Ludie Mae Tucker. It never came.
There was no physical evidence of him being there. There was a palm print on the door, never linked to Rocky, never linked to family members or anything like that. So, if there's a possibility of it being the perpetrator, it certainly was not Rocky.
I just knew as Miss Tucker, a nice white lady like that, and gave me stuff if I needed for, some bread or anything that I needed that could go on my table. She would help me out, stuff like that there, and just someone that I would just rather help than hurt.
Going into the deliberation room kind of had a cloud hanging over it already, because you knew you couldn't, it didn't matter what you said, you couldn't get anywhere with certain people. They weren't going to listen to anything. We felt like if we had a hung jury, that he would in time go to trial again and could possibly be sentenced to death. For the judge to just not accept that. Why were we chosen? Why did it go to trial? I don't know of anything I could have done differently.
Rocky's case is out of court, so he has no ability to appeal his conviction, no matter what. The only option for him at this point could be about his sentence, and so we will ask the governor for clemency, meaning would she commute his sentence to life without parole.
Roy Edward Perkins, 29 years on death row. He kidnapped and shot Katie Gilliam, and he also essayed 3 other women in 1990. He is now 63 years old. Willie Jr. Burgess, 29 years on death row. He was charged with shooting and killing the female owner of a shop that he was trying to rob. Burgess is now 49 years old. Eugene Milton Clemens, 28 years on death row. He is guilty of fatally shooting Federal Drug Enforcement Special Agent George Douglas Ault in a carjacking in 1992. He is now 52 years old. Larry Donald George, 29 years on death row. He was convicted for murdering 2 neighbors in 1988 and then shooting his ex-wife, leaving her paralyzed from the waist down. He is now 68 years old. Anthony Boyd, 28 years on death row. Together with another friend, he took revenge on Gregory Hughley in 1993 by burning him to death for a debt related to drugs. He is now 52 years old. Michael Carruth, 20 years on death row. He was convicted along with another man for the murder of 12-year-old Brett Boyer. They shot him 3 times in the head and they cut his father's throat, then buried the man in a shallow grave from which he managed to dig himself out and call for help. Forrest Boyer dragged himself to a nearby road and insisted his kid was treated first, even if the cut he had was year to year.
12, 1021.
Okay, sir, you got any idea what your name is? Come here. The ambulance is here, sir. Hold on. Right there.
I was shot 3 times.
Okay, hold on, sir, hold on. All right. Hold on, sir, hold on. Okay, ambulance is here.
I'll get my voice first.
All right. All right, sir, hold on, real quick. What's your name?
Butch.
Butch what?
Warrior.
Sir, who did this?
Jim Brooks.
Brooks?
It's not Jim. It's not his dad. It's his son. He thought I know who he was.
Hey, Lon, no bullshit. I got a man, his throat's been cut to hell. He said his son's been shot 3 times, is buried in a grave down here at Uchi, and he wants to go get him. He was buried and dug himself out. This is a bad one. This guy's throat is cut to hell.
The 2 criminals had posed as police officers, and this was all an attempt to rob the victim. This was not the only conviction they got, however. They were also charged with murdering Thurman Ray Ratliff, 68 years old, and Catherine Combs Ratliff, 62 years old. Carruth is now 65 years old. James Edward Barber, 19 years on death row. Barber was convicted for murdering Dorothy Epps, a 75-year-old lady who he had known for the majority of his life. He was in fact her handyman and was very often in contact with the victim before deciding to rob her. At the time, her husband was out of town and he told the neighbors to keep an eye on his wife in case she needed anything. Barber killed Dorothy with a hammer and his palm print was found at the crime scene. He is now 64 years old. Charlie Washington, 19 years on death row. He was sentenced to death for the murder of Julian and Florence McKinnon, a couple for which he had worked as a handyman. Julian McKinnon had just closed the sale for a piece of property land that he owned, and Washington was the one that drove him to meet the buyer that day. During the night, Washington entered the couple's house and murdered them with the intent of robbing them. Washington is now 75 years old. Jimmy Lee Brooks, 19 years on death row. Brooks was the second man involved in the murder of 12-year-old Brett Boyer along with Carruth Michael. His lawyers argue that he does not deserve to die because he did not plan on ending the life of the little boy and because he is showing remorse. Brooks is now 44 years old. James Ben Brownfield, 19 years on death row. He was convicted for the murder of his sister, Brenda McCutcheon, her husband, Latham McCutcheon, and his sister's 3-year-old grandson, Joshua Hodges. Brownfield consumed Xanax pills on December 23, 2001, became enraged with his sister over drugs and money, then killed her and Joshua with a claw hammer. Brenda McCutcheon suffered approximately 20 blows to the head and other injuries to her body. Joshua suffered approximately 16 blows to the head and, of course, other injuries to his body as well. They both died from multiple blunt force injuries. Brownfield traveled across town to her estranged husband's house after killing Brenda and Joshua, pretending it was a friendly visit to obtain entry, and then struck him with his fists and the hammer. Latham McCutcheon received 10 powerful hits to the skull from the claw hammer, among other injuries. Then Brownfield used a knife to slit his throat and stab him in the heart. He is now 49 years old. Antonio Jones, 19 years on death row. Jones was convicted for the murder of Ruth Kirkland, an 80-year-old woman. The victim drove her 1990 white Cadillac to the grocery store in the afternoon of December 31, 1999, to buy some items that she was missing. Mrs. Kirkland, a tiny woman who had suffered a stroke and had been living alone since the death of her husband, was left with a limp and a weak right arm. She also needed a walker or cane to go around. Mrs. Kirkland kept money at her home, which was widely known in the neighborhood. She had to make numerous trips inside to bring her goods, and by the time she was finished, it was getting dark. In the end, she just left the remaining of the groceries in the car overnight because she did not like being outside after dark. When Antonio Jones arrived at Mrs. Kirkland's home later, he shut off the circuit breakers outside before entering. The police were unable to tell from the evidence whether Jones forced entry or whether Miss Kirkland unlocked the door to check on the power outage, allowing Jones to enter freely. Mrs. Kirkland tried to defend herself, but Jones kicked and beat her. She fought back against Jones's attacks. She fractured both of her wrists. She was brutally beaten by Jones, who also used one of her walking canes and a broken chair leg in addition to his hands and feet. Mrs. Kirkland's broken cane and bloody spatters were discovered throughout the house, as well as several rooms. Jones ransacked the house looking for the money that she supposedly kept hidden, then he took her car and fled the scene. Mrs. Kirkland was found later in the night by her grandson, who was a police officer. Jones is now 42 years old. Michael Brown, 19 years on death row. Betty Kirkpatrick, 65 years old, was found dead in her mobile home in Hueytown in October 12, 2001 by Ricky Kirkpatrick, her son, and his wife. Her throat had been slit, and she had a garbage bag covering her head. On her chest were a paper towel and a knife. Both Betty Kirkpatrick's pocketbook and her 1986 gold Ford Thunderbird were gone. According to the testimony of the forensic pathologist, Betty Kirkpatrick perished from asphyxia by strangling and smothering. Brown was seen driving her car around, and many people testified that he had actually described the murder to them. He is now 46 years old. Brandon Benjamin, 19 years on death row. He was convicted for murdering Jimmy Lewis with the purpose of robbing him. On the evening of November 18, 2000, about 9 p.m., Jimmy Lewis went to the Wiregrass Commons Mall to pick up his wife, who ran a store there. Because it was raining outside, he decided to return to the car that was parked rather far from the entry to bring the automobile closer for when his wife exited the mall. Benjamin had specifically gone to the mall in search of a victim to rob. He parked his car in a spot that wouldn't attract attention and kept an eye on mall security to see how frequently they made rounds. Benjamin showed up as Jimmy Lewis walked toward his car and allegedly demanded the victim's wallet. After a short struggle, he shot the victim twice, once in the leg and once in the chest, and beat him several times. After taking the victim's wallet and its contents, the criminal fled the scene. When the police and paramedics eventually arrived, the victim had already passed away. Benjamin is now 43 years old. Mohammad Sharifi, 18 years on death row. Iranian national Mohammad Sharifi arrived in Huntsville in December 1998 with a 6-month tourist visa. He married American citizen Sarah K. Smith just before the visa ran out. Sharifi and Sarah split up in late 1999. After that, Sarah and Derek Brown went to the Immigration and Naturalization Service to meet with Sharifi's caseworker. Sharifi's petition to become a legal alien was rejected as a result of the meeting. On December 6, 1999, Sharifi purchased a pistol. Invading the flat he had shared with Sarah on December 13, 1999, Sharifi was forcibly removed from the flat with only his clothes after the Huntsville police were summoned to the incident. Sharifi fled with a promise to come back. Sarah replaced the locks on the apartment's doors after Sharifi left, but later that day he returned and he was furious to see that the locks had been changed. When Sharifi discovered Derek Brown was in the apartment despite though he was not permitted to be there, he became even more upset. The last time anyone saw Sarah and Brown alive was on December 13, 1999. Sarah's body was discovered on the Tennessee River's banks on December 26, 1999. It had been wrapped in black plastic bags and secured with an electrical cord. Brown's body was discovered partially wrapped in black plastic bags and tied with an electrical cord in the Tennessee River on January 1, 2000. Brown and Sarah both received head injuries from gunfire. Following forensic investigations, it was established that the weapon Sharifi bought on December 1999 was the one used to shoot both victims. Sharifi is now 57 years old. Christopher Shane Hyde, 18 years on death row. 3 people were killed during a holdup at a small-town funeral home, and a man who was only 4 months out of prison in Florida after serving time for attempting to kill someone during a robbery has been charged with capital murder. Christopher Shane Hyde was detained in connection with the deaths of 2 employees and the driver for a casket firm at Bell Funeral Home thanks to a tip from a witness. Together with the funeral home's manager, June Williams, 61 years old, Rick Peterson, 50 years old, served as the pastor of the Faith Worship Center in Summiton. Authorities said that Randall Lane, 66 years old, a semi-retired manager of a casket company, was making a delivery when all 3 of them were fatally shot. A few hours after the murder, police detained Hyde as he boarded a bus from Birmingham to Atlanta. After the murders, a relative drove Hyde to Birmingham, but it seems like they had no idea what had transpired. He is now 51 years old. Ondra Marshall, 18 years on death row. The deaths of Clarence Kyle, 48 years old, and his wife Allison, 38 years old, in February 2004, led to the conviction of Ondra Marshall for capital murder. According to prosecution testimony, Marshall battered, shackled, and shoved the victims into a car trunk before dousing them with gasoline and setting the vehicle on fire. It seems like the motive was a drug debt. Marshall is now 50 years old. Diane Eatman, 18 years on death row. He participated in the kidnapping of Clarence and Allison Kyle along with Ondra Marshall. He is now 46 years old. Wesley Devon Harris, 18 years on death row. Harris terrorized and murdered his girlfriend's grandmother, parents, and 3 teenage brothers. 65-year-old Mila Ruth Ball was the matriarch of a family that resided on a farm near Moody's Crossroad, Crenshaw County. Joanne, her 35-year-old daughter, and Willie Haslip, 40-year-old, shared a trailer on the family farm where they raised their 3 kids, Jerry Ball, 19 years old, Tony Ball, 17 years old, and Joni Ball, 14 years old. Janice Ball, a 16-year-old daughter of Joanne and Willie, shared the farmhouse with her grandmother, Mila. When Janice first met Harris, he was 19 years old and she was just 14. Janice fell pregnant 3 months after the two first met, and they had a daughter, Nashay, whom they called Shay. According to Janice's testimony, she barely saw Harris after telling him she was pregnant until Shay was born. Then, she and Harris shared a trailer in Laverne. Janice claimed that Harris turned aggressive, at which point she returned to the farm and lived with her grandmother. After a fight with the entire family, Harris decided to murder everyone except Janice and Shay, and that's exactly what he did. He shot them all, one by one, starting with the grandmother and continuing with the brothers and parents. He then took Janice and his daughter, as well as the family dog, to a 3-day trip in which they visited multiple friends of his. Eventually, Harris's aunt persuaded him to turn himself over to the authorities. While her entire family was being murdered, Janice was threatened by the father of her child to stay quiet and not warn anybody, because if she did, he would shoot her as well. I cannot imagine the terror and heartbreak she had to go through. This was absolutely horrible. Harris is now 43 years old. Kerry Spencer, 18 years on death row. He was convicted, along with Nathaniel Woods, for the murder of 3 police officers in 2004. The officers, Carlos Owen, 58 years old, Harley Chisholm, 40 years old, and Charles Bennett, 33 years old, were shot dead when they approached the house in which the 2 criminals were staying and allegedly dealing drugs. Nathaniel Woods was considered an accomplice. He got the death penalty and he was executed in 2020, and there was a lot of controversy revolving his punishment. In fact, Kerry Spencer had said multiple times that he was the one that killed the officers and that Woods had not participated in the crime, he was just there. Spencer is still waiting for his execution date to be set, even if he was convicted before Woods. He is now 43 years old. Devin Darnell Thompson. On the morning of June 3, 2003, at about 3 in the morning, Officer Crump and Officer Strickland approached a car parked in a nearby restaurant lot and discovered Thompson inside, asleep. The officers detained Thompson after the dispatcher notified them that the car had been stolen. While the police were registering Thompson, they learned that a dry cleaning shop nearby where the automobile had been stolen had been broken into, and its inventory of clothing had been stolen as well. At the scene of the burglary, a shoe print was found. In order to collect Thompson's fingerprints and the shoe print, the officers had to take off his handcuffs. Thompson shot Strickland in the head with a .40 caliber service handgun while the officer was trying to take his fingerprints. Thompson then moved down the hallway and fatally wounded Officer Crump. He then came upon Miller as he was making his way out of the police station. He repeatedly shot Miller before leaving the station. Thompson then drove off after stealing a police car. Later that day, close to Columbus, Mississippi, he was detained. Officer Strickland's weapon, which Thompson had stolen, was discovered in the police car. Thompson, a recent high school graduate, was never in trouble before and had no criminal history. At the end of the summer, he was supposed to report for duty in the Air Force. He is now 38 years old. Timothy Wade Saunders, 18 years on death row. On July 9th, Saunders bought crack cocaine twice. The first time he spent $50 on the drug and smoked it, and the second time he spent $100. Saunders claimed he went into the property next to his mother's mobile home. He told Mr. Clemens that he was getting high when he noticed him and asked him what he was doing there. Mr. Clemens then yelled at him and told him to leave the property. Saunders overheard him mention calling the police. This made him angry. He grabbed the crowbar and repeatedly struck Mr. Clemens in the head. He had borrowed that same crowbar from Mr. Clemens earlier that day. He then made the decision to go up to the Clemenses' home in an effort to steal any valuables so he could purchase more crack cocaine. He acknowledged that he pretended to have an asthma attack so that Mrs. Clemens would let him into the house. Saunders claimed that when Mrs. Clemens attempted to call for help, he became enraged and grabbed her from behind. Mrs. Clemens was taken to a rear bedroom by Saunders, who claimed he didn't mean to hurt her, and did it so he could close the door and flee. He then walked to his mother's trailer. Mr. Clemens was 77 years old. Saunders is now 44 years old. Jeremy Bryan Jones, 18 years on death row. He was found guilty of capital murder in the 2004 rape and gunshot death of Lisa Maureen Nichols, 44 years old. In Georgia, Jones is accused of killing Amanda Greenwell, 16 years old, in Douglasville. He is allegedly a suspect in the disappearance of Patrice Enders, a hairdresser from Forsyth County. According to investigators, he may be involved in another 10 murders. Jones assured the judge that God would have the last say before the punishment was read. Jones had severe mental and emotional difficulties, according to his defense counsel, including a long-term drug addiction that ought to be considered a mitigating circumstance. He is now 50 years old. Kenneth Eugene Billups, 17 years on death row. 24 years old Stephen Lockett was fatally shot by Kenneth Billups, and 3 days later, Billups also killed Rafael Salcedo, 15 years old, Enrique Marquez, 16 years old, Wilbur Gomez, 20 years old, and Manuel Perez Nunez, 27 years old. He pretended to be a drug dealer in order to get the 4 victims to a Center Point condominium on December 16, 2003. When they arrived, he killed all 4. Billups is now 50 years old. Christopher Anthony Floyd, 17 years on death row. He was convicted of murdering Archie Wayland Crawford, a grocery store owner, during a robbery in 1992. Patrick Emonson, the defense counsel, made an effort to cast doubt on whether the murder took place during a robbery, which would have made it a case for the death sentence. However, District Attorney Doug Valeska cited a recorded confession in which Floyd admitted to robbing Crawford. Floyd is now 51 years old. William Bruce Marshall, 17 years on death row. The Vestavia Hills Police Department received a call from Tonya Bentley on December 28, 2004, informing them that her daughter Alicia was missing from their residence. Marshall and Tonya Bentley had split up in the beginning of December 2004. From the apartment they had occupied with Marshall, Tonya, Alicia, and Tonya's infant boy had relocated to an apartment in a separate building. On the evening of December 29th, the day after Alicia went missing and while being questioned by the FBI, Marshall acknowledged that he had done a terrible thing. According to Marshall, Alicia and him got into a verbal altercation that had turned violent, and he had punched her in the head with his hand. He explained that he had brought her out in the country and left her there, but he was unsure if she was okay. Marshall traveled outside of Columbiana in a vehicle with law enforcement officers. He was finally able to direct authorities to Alicia's body after scouring off many side roads. Except for a pair of white socks, she was naked. The body's examination confirmed that Alicia had been killed by strangulation. Marshall is now 59 years old. Thomas Robert Lane, 17 years on death row. He got the death penalty for murdering his wife. Teresa, a Filipina immigrant who resided with a friend in Irvington while she lived apart from her husband Lane, was discovered dead in the bathtub. Teresa Lane sustained injuries resembling those caused by blunt force trauma. Although there were no indications of forced entry inside the house, a forensic expert was able to match a chisel mark within the front door frame to a tool discovered inside Thomas Lane struck in the days following the murder. Ashley Rich, the district attorney for Mobile County, led the prosecution in constructing a case based on Lane's need for money and concern over moving on with a new wife. Rich presented documents indicating Lane's financial devastation as he prepared for a divorce because Lane was financially dependent on his wife. According to neighbors and other people who came into contact with Lane, he was quite open about his hatred for his wife and his intentions for the future once he was divorced. According to a nearby Nissan salesman, Lane once said, "The only decent woman is a dead one." A co-worker of Lane's wife testified that Lane instructed her to tell his wife that she would be regretful if she decided not to come back. He is now 58 years old. Craig Newton, 17 years on death row. The victim, Charles Clarence Watley and Chandra Alexander, met up and started consuming crack cocaine at Alexander's house on the evening of April 30, 2001. They ran out of drugs early on May 1, 2001, so they decided looking for more. They visited the house in Tuskegee, Alabama, in search of drugs, where they ran across Craig Newton. He claimed that he could help them to buy more narcotics. Watley, Alexander, and Newton made a stop at the Watley's home on their route to get the drugs. When Newton arrived at Watley's house, he wanted to know where the cash and the weapons were located. Additionally, Newton gave Alexander instructions to use an electrical line to bind the victim. Newton attempted to suffocate Watley by placing a sack over his head while he struggled to free himself from the cord. Newton continued to demand information regarding the location of the victim's weapons and money while he started to free himself from the plastic bag. Newton then doused the victim in gasoline or lighter fluid and lit him on fire. According to the co-defendant's testimony, the victim had put out the fire on himself when Newton approached him, pointed the pistol at the side of the victim's head, and shot him. Newton is now 47 years old. Michael Lynn Sale, 17 years on death row. He was accused of physically and emotionally terrorizing his wife until she died in a hospital. Lynn Sale, his wife, succumbed to her injuries, including gangrene, bruising, and bite marks, 15 days after he called 911 and had her admitted to a hospital in Dothan. Michael Crespi, the defense attorney, requested the jury to advise life in prison without the possibility of parole. During the trial, he told the jury that Michael Sale provided his wife with food, water, and medication before eventually dialing 911. Sale is now 68 years old. Jason Michael Sharp, 17 years on death row. According to court records, Jason Sharp essayed and killed Tracy Morris, a nurse. The trial took 7 years to start, and the judge and jury decided the offense was severe enough to warrant the death penalty. Sharp is now 46 years old. Ellis Lewis Mashburn, 17 years on death row. He was sentenced to death for the murder of Clara Ava Birmingham, 80 years old, and her husband, Henry Birmingham, 85 years old. The murders started as a robbery, and the victims were in fact his grandparents. The couple died from stab wounds and blunt force trauma. Both have been severely beaten and stabbed. They were discovered on October 30th, and the murders occurred on the evening of October 29. Both Clara Birmingham and her husband tried to defend themselves and were aware of their impending deaths. Mashburn is now 45 years old. Corey Shirod Smith, 28 years on death row. The burnt remains of Kimberly Brooks were found rolled in a carpet on February 24, 1995, by a gravel road in Bibbtown, according to Tallapoosa police. The coroner testified that Brooks died from shots to the head and the chest and suspected asphyxiation. I'm going to read you the written confession of Corey Smith about what happened to Kimberly. Kim came to the house around 7:30 a.m. Wednesday morning with Labrisha Main. We was talking about getting married later on. My brother Reginald came and Main left. After a while, Reginald left. When my mama got off work, me and Kim got into an argument about another girl calling me. We went outside. I pulled my gun on her. Sanjay Brooks and Shantai Smith pulled up. I forced her into the van. I told Sanjay to go to Bibbtown, which he did. And when we got there, Kim and I got out, continuing arguing. I told her I love her, and if I couldn't have her, no one could. She told me she loved me, but things weren't the same. I kissed her on the forehead and pushed her off me and shot her in the chest. and then she fell to the ground, and I shot her again towards her head. Shantai got out and helped me drag her into the bushes. We left. Sanjay dropped us off into the soft sands. When he returned, we got James Shealy's car and got some gas and went back where I left her. When we got there, she was standing up, and she got into the car and sat beside me. I was scared. Sanjay rode from Biptown to Realtown looking for a place to set her on fire and bury her. I asked her what she would say if I took her to the hospital. She say, "I'm going to say Corey shot me." We returned back to Biptown and Sanjay dropped us off. He told us to go ahead and finish her and he'll be back. We put a trash bag over her face until she died. I poured the gas on her and Shantai lit the lighter. Sanjay never returned. We left there and walked back to my house. Shantai spent the night. The next day he left and I never saw him again. Corey Smith's co-defendants, Sanjay Brooks and Shantai Smith, Smith's cousins, got life in prison after agreeing to testify against Corey. He is now 47 years old. Bobby Jr. Baker, 28 years on death row. On April 10, 1994, Baker kidnapped his estranged wife Tracy from her house, coerced her into his car, and then fatally shot her 5 times. Prior to his retrial, Baker gained notoriety when authorities discovered the hit list in his cell shortly after his 1995 conviction. Houston County Circuit Judge Lawson Little was one of the people on the list, and despite the ostensible threat to his life, he refused to step aside from presiding over the trial. Baker is now 50 years old. Ulysses Charles Sneed, 28 years on death row. Clarence Eugene Terry, 51 years old, the clerk of a convenience shop, was shot and killed during a heist by Charles Sneed and John Hardy. He was shot 5 times in the head and once in the chest. Hardy being the one who pulled the trigger, while Sneed was stealing the money in the cash register. Sneed and Hardy were detained in Louisville, where Hardy was visiting family. They were found guilty and given death sentences. In 2016, John Hardy passed away in prison. Sneed is now 54 years old. Albert Mack, 27 years on death row. Patrick Corey Holman's body was discovered in the trunk of a 1974 Oldsmobile Cutlass on the evening of July 12, 1993. In the vicinity of the entrance to the Royal Pines development, a suburban area close to Tuscaloosa, the Cutlass was parked on the side of Saunders Ferry Road. He had been shot in the back of the head, instantly murdered, his body put in the trunk, and the car had been set on fire. The prosecution argued that the crime happened during a robbery, reason for which Mack received the death penalty. The defense team, however, claimed that Mack shot Holman because he believed he was planning to kill Mack and his friend Roy Craig. Craig had sold Holman $500 worth of poor dope. Mack is now 56 years old. Kerry Dale Grayson, 27 years on death row. Vicky Deblio, age 37, was dropped off by a friend on I-59 close to Chattanooga, Tennessee on the evening of February 21, 1994, so she could hitchhike to her mother's house in Louisiana. She was spotted traveling by 4 teens who had been consuming alcohol and using drugs. Kerry Grayson, Kenny Loggins, Trace Duncan, and Luis Mangione. Instead of taking her to Louisiana as they had promised, they drove her to a secluded area while pretending to pick up another vehicle. When they got out of the car and arrived in this place, they all started drinking. Miss Deblio started to flee from the boys who were throwing bottles at her. They kicked her repeatedly all over her body after tackling her to the ground. When they saw she was still alive, one of them, supported by Grayson, stood on her throat till she gurgled blood and murmured, "Okay, I'll party," before passing away. After removing her clothing and ring, they placed her body in the back of a pickup truck, drove her and her luggage to Bald Rock Mountain, where they played with her body before tossing it off a cliff. They next headed to a Pell City car wash to wash the blood from the truck. They searched through her bags and concealed it in the forest. They brought Mangione home after leaving Birmingham and went back to Bald Rock Mountain to begin mutilating the body. They stabbed and sliced her 180 times, removed part of a lung, and severed her fingers and thumbs. 3 rock climbers discovered Mrs. Deblio's body on February 26, 1994, and reported it to the authorities. The office of the medical examiner received her body. Her left lung had been removed, all of her fingers and both thumbs had been severed, and the medical examiner discovered 180 stab wounds post-mortem done, 2 large incisions in her chest, almost every bone in her skull fractured, every bone in her face fractured at least once, lacerations over these fractures, and the missing tooth. The medical examiner concluded that she was still alive during the beating and that blunt force injuries to the head were the cause of death. After Mangione started showing one of Mrs. Deblio's fingers to his friends, all accused were subsequently detained. Grayson is now 49 years old. James William McGowan, 27 years on death row. He was sentenced to death for the murder of an elderly couple. Deidre Ann Crane was also part of the crime. In 1997, Cray testified before a jury that McGowan took her up from her parents' house at midday, and the two of them used nearly all of the $150 worth of crack he had with him. They were running low on supplies, so he bought $50 more. She claimed that she eventually sold her ring for $20, using the proceeds to purchase more crack. Later, the pair went to the Harper's house, where James McGowan made up a tale to get Harper to give them $125 so they could buy more cocaine. They went back to Harper's house when James Robert Pitts declined to give them any money. Crane testified that while traveling there, they acquired the murderous weapon. When they got there, Crane kept Harper occupied while McGowan fatally struck him with a hammer from behind at least 4 times. The duo used the $165 they discovered in their victim's wallet to purchase more crack. The two then drove to Evergreen, stopping along the route at the Johnson's residence in the Antioch neighborhood, according to the trial testimony. McGowan struck Johnson, 82 years old, 3 times on top of the head with the hammer as soon as he turned his back on him. Crane claimed that as she went outside, she could see McGowan's shadow as he raised the hammer and repeatedly struck Johnson's widow, 79 years old, through the bedroom window. During the penalty phase, a jury recommended that McGowan be given a life sentence without the possibility of release. McGowan was found guilty of 2 charges of capital murder, and the trial judge overturned the jury's verdict, ordering that he be executed for the heinous acts. Crane got life in prison. McGowan is now 70 years old. Larry Wayne Whitehead, 27 years on death row. Larry Whitehead was detained and charged with a significant theft that had the possible outcome of landing him in a life sentence in jail. As a background story, Whitehead worked at a company where he would clock in and then leave, only to come back to clock out just before his shift was supposed to end. He was charged with stealing around $12,000 from this company. The officer that interviewed him and arrested him for this was Detective Andrew Whitten, and he was shot and killed so that he would not have a chance to testify against Whitehead. Whitehead is now 61 years old. Demetrius Terrence Frazier, 12 years on death row. Demetrius Frazier confessed to the murder and essay of Pauline Brown while serving a life sentence in Michigan. In March 1992, Frazier was detained in Detroit, Michigan on suspicion of crimes unconnected to the Alabama case. While in the Detroit Police Department's care, Frazier admitted to robbing, and killing Miss Brown. Frazier served more than 18 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections after being found guilty in April 1993 of armed robbery, criminal sexual conduct, felony possession of firearms, and felony murder. For that, he was given a life sentence in prison. He is now 52 years old. Tony Barksdale, 26 years on death row. He was convicted for shooting and murdering 18-year-old Julie Rhodes on December 1, 1995. Barksdale, an attractive 19-year-old black male who was born and raised in the Washington, D.C. area, approached Rhodes as she was parking her car in the mall's parking lot. Barksdale was looking for a ride to take him and his 2 white friends, Kevin Hilburn and Jonathan David Garrison, back to their home in Guntersville, Alabama, which was about 2 hours away. But Rhodes only had a few minutes before she had to report back to work. The request for the lengthy travel was absurd. Barksdale persevered, though. The Knollwood apartments are located on the other side of town. Would she take the 3 of them there? She also didn't have time for that. How about in the middle? Eventually, she gave in. The 3 young men climbed inside her vehicle and began the short drive, which should only have taken a few minutes. Directions were given by Barksdale from the back seat. He directed Rhodes to turn right into Charlotte Lane, a cul-de-sac, after leaving the 6th Avenue extension. She stopped the car so that her 3 new pals could exit. Barksdale then pulled out a 9mm weapon. The 2 other men huddled behind the garden shed 50 feet away from Charlotte Lane as they fled into the night. The exact details of what transpired afterwards are hotly contested. The only people who saw what happened were Rhodes, who was found nearly dead later that night with 2 bullet wounds to her face and neck, and Barksdale. Rhodes survived long enough for a neighboring couple to find her and hear her exclaim, "A black man shot me." Barksdale is now 46 years old. Vernon Lamar Yancey, 26 years on death row. On March 23, 1995, Matty Pee Wee Sports, a cashier at Tyler's grocery store, was fatally shot with a sawed-off shotgun. Around 10:30 p.m. on the night of the murder, Sports and his daughter-in-law Lisa Navas were working at Tyler's shop when a client walked in. The client saw Yancey coming toward the store and then running away from it around 10 minutes later as he was leaving the parking lot of the shop. He had on a pair of blue jeans and no further clothing. A man with an orange ski mask, gloves, and a sawed-off shotgun who was wearing a raincoat entered the business around 5 minutes after the customer had departed. Sports was shot in the face from close range as the man approached her straight and leveled the shotgun at her. She died immediately. The man pursued Navas as she made an attempt to flee to the restroom and lock the door, but she was unable to do so because he caught her. He requested money from her, and Navas gave it to him from a cash register and from money stashed inside a pack of Benson & Hedges cigarettes. The man gave off the impression that he was aware that the store had more money that was shown by the cash register. Later, the store's owner stated in court that about $1,500 was stolen during the theft. The man's ski mask was loose and did not entirely conceal his face, so as Navas knelt down to get the money, she glanced up and saw a familiar face from the store. She claimed that she could see his face well and that she knew his eyes. She claimed that after that she averted her gaze out of concern that he might become aware of her recognition of him. After taking the cash, the man fled the shop. Navas, who was at that point lying on the ground next to the victim, activated the silent alarm, dialed 911, and waited for the police. Yancey is now 53 years old. Donald Broadnax, 26 years on death row. Donald Broadnax, who had been found guilty of murder in 1978 and was presently serving a 99-year prison term, lived in a work-release facility in Alexander City and worked at Welborn Forest Products there in April 1996. Broadnax married Jan Stamps in 1995. She was the grandmother of D'Angelo Stamps, who was then 3 years old. Broadnax and Jan were experiencing marital issues, and he thought Jan was primarily to blame for a recent parole denial. According to the evidence, Jan and D'Angelo delivered lunch to Broadnax at his employment on April 25, 1996, after 6 p.m. Broadnax's co-worker at Welborn and prisoner at the work-release facility, Johnny Baker, testified in court that he saw Broadnax driving Jan's car. Later that night, a couple reported a suspicious vehicle parked across the street to their house. At around 9 p.m., Birmingham Police Department officers who had responded to the call arrived at the house. They saw blood on the ground behind the parked car and on the bumper as they got closer. They promptly radioed their supervisor and the paramedics based on their observations. Then they secured the site. The automobile belonged to Jan Broadnax. When the paramedics arrived, they unlocked the trunk and discovered Jan and D'Angelo's remains inside. They had each suffered injuries. Jan and D'Angelo died from blunt force trauma, which may have been brought on by using a piece of lumber like the one discovered in the trunk with the bodies, according to Dr. Robert Brissy, the forensic pathologist who conducted the examinations on the victims. Broadnax is now 61 years old. Corey Maples, 26 years on death row. Maples was given the death penalty for shooting and murdering two of his friends, Stacy Allen Terry and Barry Dwayne Robinson, while they were in their car in front of Maples' house getting ready to leave. When he was apprehended by the police nearly a month later, he fully confessed to what he did, but he said he does not know why he did that. He just couldn't recall why he decided to kill them. He still appears on Alabama death row list, but I read that in 2022, the district court granted Maples' habeas corpus petition and directed Alabama to vacate Maples' death sentence and re-sentence him to life without the possibility of parole, or initiate proceedings for a new penalty phase hearing. This was because he did not have proper representation at his initial trial. He is now 49 years old. Taurus Carroll, 25 years on death row. He was already serving time in prison when he murdered a fellow inmate, Michael Turner. Carroll accused Turner of stealing his cell phone, according to the testimony given during the trial. Turner repeatedly denied the theft, but Carroll stabbed him many times with a prison-made blade constructed from a piece of an air conditioner vent. Turner suffered 16 stab wounds to his body, neck, and skull. He passed away in the jail hospital. Carroll allegedly admitted to a correctional guard that he did intend to kill Turner, not just hurt him. He is now 46 years old. Artez Hammonds, 25 years on death row. Marilyn Mitchell was ready to make a cake for her mother's birthday on May 15, 1990. The 22-year-old, who had only recently graduated from college, could not have had a more promising future. With a nursing degree, she started working for Southeast Health, moved into a beautiful house in Dothan, and began planning her wedding to her high school sweetheart. Hammonds went back to Mrs. Mitchell's house after delivering furnishings to her a day or two earlier. He essayed her and viciously stabbed her 38 times. In a very short while, he had taken a shower, he smoked a cigarette, and turned the ashes over Mrs. Mitchell's body. He quietly left her Chapelwood home in broad daylight. It took the Dothan police 6 years to find him, until Hammonds was finally connected to the crime site by DNA. He is now 53 years old. Jerry Jerome Smith, 25 years on death row. On October 19, 1996, at around 8:30 p.m., a drug dealer named Smith visited Flournoy's home in Dothan to collect $1,500 that Flournoy owed him for crack cocaine. Flournoy informed Smith that while he did not have the money at the time, he would later that evening. Smith left, but his girlfriend and him returned to Flournoy's house later that evening. When they arrived, Smith was carrying a sawed-off .22 caliber rifle under his shirt. Flournoy reiterated his claim that he lacked the funds Smith was owed. Flournoy, who was unarmed, pleaded for his life, but Smith shot him in the chest. The other residents of the house were unarmed as well, so Smith then turned his weapon on them. Bennett was shot in the head while sitting in a chair, and Helms was shot 6 times in the chest as she attempted to run. Both passed away on the spot. Flournoy made an attempt to flee, but passed out in his yard. The gunshot wound to his chest ultimately caused his death. Derek Gross was the target of another attempt by Smith, but the weapon jammed. Smith tried to take a knife from his girlfriend as he and Gross struggled with the rifle, but Gross managed to get away. Smith escaped the scene after the shootings. He arranged for a friend to conceal the gun. He dressed differently and made an effort to elude the police. The following morning, however, he was taken into custody at his father's home. Smith is now 52 years old. Michael Craig Maxwell, 25 years on death row. Harold Pugh and Joey Pugh, his 11-year-old son, were reported missing to the Colbert County Sheriff's Office on July 21, 1997. A friend of the Pughs named Mike Sennett stated that he and other friends went searching for the Pughs at Cane Creek in Colbert County early on July 21st after learning of their disappearance. The Pughs were being looked for in the same region by both the local authorities and the rescue team. Sennett stated that both Harold and his son liked to fish. Sennett was the one who discovered Harold and Joey Pugh's bodies floating in the creek while making one final trip up Cane Creek in his boat before returning home. The next day's autopsies showed that each victim had received 2 headshots. 2 armed men who were dressed in dark-colored army fatigues, hooded shirts, sunglasses, and gloves robbed the Deposit Guarantee National Bank in Belmont, Mississippi on the day the victims' bodies were discovered. A bank employee testified that while he was unable to identify the men responsible for the robbery, he was able to identify the truck they fled in. The police located the truck because it was set on fire and they were led to it by the smoke. A suspect was arrested and he explained what happened. His name was Ferguson and he admitted to the police that on the day of the killings, he and the other criminals were searching for 2 vehicles to take and use in the bank robbery in Belmont. Ferguson claimed that while they were searching for a vehicle to take, Moore, Maxwell, Graham, and Risley came across the Pugh's truck parked close to the Cane Creek boat launch. According to Ferguson, Harold Pugh climbed out of the boat and into his truck when the Pugh family arrived at the landing in their boat. He claimed that Maxwell was directing the Pughs to get back into the boat while pointing a gun at them before he even realized it. Maxwell and Moore leaped into the boat before Moore gave the command for Ferguson to follow. Ferguson claimed that both Moore and Maxwell were carrying pistols. Ferguson said that he was not carrying any type of weapon. They continued downstream in the boat with the victims while Risley and Graham waited with the truck. After hearing a shot, Ferguson turned and he saw Maxwell shooting Harold Pugh. He insisted that he had no idea who shot Joey Pugh, but he did admit that Maxwell and Moore were responsible for tossing the bodies of the victims into the creek. Maxwell is now 52 years old. Jared Taylor, 25 years on death row. Following a burglary gone wrong at Steve Dias Motors on December 12, 1997, Taylor was found guilty of triple homicide. According to prosecution testimony, he and co-defendant Kenyatta McMillan were carrying out a plot to loot the dealership when Taylor put a revolver to the heads of Steve Dias and Bruce and Sherry Gaston and fired the trigger. The prosecution's main witness, McMillan, claimed that the victims were wailing, sobbing, and pleading for their lives when Taylor killed them. Due to his testimony, McMillan was spared the death penalty and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Taylor is now 52 years old. Thomas Dale Ferguson, 25 years on death row. We talked about him earlier in connection to Harold Pugh and Joey Pugh, his 11-year-old son, deaths caused by 4 men, among which Ferguson was. He is now 50 years old. Joseph Michael Wilson, 25 years on death row. In the fatal shootings of 4 people on September 25, 1996, and the injuring of 2 others at a residence on University Drive, Wilson was charged alongside Nicholas Acklin and another man. A prior incident in which a resident of the house informed the Madison County Sheriff's Department that Wilson had taken his cell phone preceded the shootings. The third man, Corey Johnson, who did not fire a shot, was freed from jail in 2011 after serving a 15-year sentence on a felony murder conviction. Acklin and Wilson were both convicted in 1998 and given death sentences. Wilson is now 46 years old. Anthony Tyson, 25 years on death row. Porter Key, a driver for Henry Trucking Company, came across Derek Cowan's body in the middle of the road on January 4, 1997, while traveling on Franklin Road in Macon County. Key observed a green Acura car veer off the road and crash into a fence. The vehicle then reversed into the road and accelerated toward Tuskegee. He followed the automobile because he believed the driver had been in a hit-and-run collision. He lost the car in Tuskegee because he was unable to keep up. Cowan had been shot twice in the back of the head and was not an accident victim. The body of Damian Thompson was found slumped forward in the passenger side of the Acura that was hidden in the bushes at the intersection of Bull Avenue and Anona Street in Tuskegee a short while after Key discovered Cowan's body. Thompson had received 2 headshots. 10 days after the double homicide in Macon County, police were looking into a shooting in Union Springs when they made the connection between Tyson and the killings. Nicholas Martin testified that when he was walking his dog, Tyson and 3 other individuals fired shots at him from a moving vehicle. He claimed to have recognized Tyson and to have visited the police station where he had authorized the issuance of an arrest order. The double homicide's murder weapon was the gun identified as the one used in the Union Springs killing. Tyson is now 52 years old. Chanel Andre Jackson, 25 years on death row. In the spring of 1997, 4 young males in a car cut off a second vehicle with 2 men inside in the area of Montgomery, Alabama, with the intention of robbing them. The driver of the second automobile was killed in a brief gun battle. All 4 of the guys in the first vehicle were accused of capital murder by the prosecution, but only one was given the death penalty, and that is Chanel Jackson. In the Jackson case, a 12-member jury unanimously decided in 1998 to impose a life sentence rather than the death penalty, in part because there was proof that the fatal gunshot originated from the gun of a different defendant. Judge William Gordon, however, used judicial discretion to alter the verdict to death based on aggravating circumstances. The other 3 men, who were close friends before the gunfight and who testified against Jackson, even though he hardly knew them, received shorter terms. One was given a life sentence, and the other 2 were eligible for parole in 2015 and in 2017. Jackson is now 45 years old. Jerry Devane Bryant, 25 years on death row. Burt Brantley and Donald Hollis traveled from Newville to an AutoZone auto parts store in Dothan on January 27, 1997, where Brantley bought transmission fluid sealer to fix his car. When they heard someone whistle at them, Hollis and Brantley were traveling along Wheat Street in Dothan. According to Brantley's testimony, Jerry Bryant and another man, Ricky Vikers, approached the automobile after Hollis turned around and stopped. Vikers left shortly after, but Hollis, Brantley, and Bryant remained together. Brantley and Bryant were drinking in the back seat while Hollis was driving the vehicle. Later in the night, Bryant pulled a gun, asked Brantley to get out of the car, and then drove off with Hollis. Bryant was charged with the murder of Donald Hollis, and several people testified against him, including his girlfriend and his other friend Ricky Vikers, who was in fact coerced into helping him get rid of the body. Bryant is now 54 years old. Joseph Clifton Smith, 25 years on death row. Police in Mobile County, Alabama, found Dirk Van Dam's severely battered body on November 25, 1997, inside his mud-caked Ford Ranger truck. According to Dr. Julia Goodin, a forensic pathologist with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, Van Dam suffered 35 separate blunt force injuries to his body before passing away. He also had a huge hemorrhage beneath his scalp, brain edema, many rib fractures, a collapsed lung, numerous abrasions to his head and knees, and defensive wounds on his hands. His neck, shoulder, and back bore markings that were compatible with those left by a saw. The most likely immediate cause of death was the numerous rib fractures that led to the collapse of one lung. Joseph Smith and Larry Reed were found guilty for robbing and murdering Van Dam. Smith is now 53 years old. Nicholas Bernard Acklin, 25 years on death row. For the 1996 killings of 4 individuals and the wounding of 2 more in a case that is still renowned for its brutality, Acklin and Joey Wilson were both given death sentences. Corey Johnson, a 3rd defendant in the case, was freed in 2011 after serving 15 years in jail for felony murder. Brian Carter, 21 years old, Michael Bodette, 19 years old, Johnny Couch, 18 years old, and Lamar Hemphill, 21 years old, were among those killed. At the age of 17, Michelle Hayden was shot in the face, elbow, and abdomen. Ashley Rutherford, who was 22 at the time, was shot in the back of the head but managed to live by acting dead. In a separate capital murder case, Johnson is accused of stabbing to death Candy Wilson, Joey Wilson's sister, in November 2016. Acklin is now 52 years old. Calvin Stallworth, 25 years on death row. Nancy Dukes was found behind the counter on her knees with her arms and face in a chair on December 4, 1997, when John Gregory entered the Dukes Parkway Shell patrol station in Foley. Despite being repeatedly stabbed, she was still breathing. Dukes passed away before the paramedics came, despite Gregory's appeal for help. Dukes had been stabbed around 40 times, according to the coroner's testimony, and she died as a result of those wounds. There was evidence that the cash register had between $400 and $600 gone. At the Diamond gas station and convenience store in Foley on December 14, 1997, Van Gardner found Linda Morton's body lying face down on the floor behind the counter. Morton had been stabbed 6 times according to the coroner's testimony. The cash register was $934 short according to an audit. On December 16, 1997, police learned that Calvin Stalwart was wanted for violating his probation as a result of their investigation into him. Police arrested and interrogated him on the 2 killings and got a search warrant to examine the house of his fiancée where he was staying. Blood was found on the inside of one of the sleeves of a hooded garment that police seized. The blood on the jacket matched Duke's DNA. A kitchen knife with a serrated edge was also discovered under the mattress during the investigation of the home. Experts testified that the knife used to kill Dukes and Morton was the same model. Stalwart is now 53 years old. Melvin Davis, 25 years on death row. When he passed away, Timothy Ray was 27 years old. At point-blank range, 7 shots were fired at him. 67-year-old John Bradley was killed by 3 execution-style shots fired at him from a close distance. At the time of his headshot, Eugene Smith was 50 years old. Amazingly, he made it through and provided testimony in court. As the informant in a drug case against Davis and his brother Princeton Davis, Charlie Boswell Jr. was the target of the murders. When the shootings took place, Boswell Jr. was not even in the house. Davis is now 52 years old. DeForest Onisha Johnson, 25 years on death row. Johnson received a death sentence for the 1995 slaying of a Birmingham police officer who was not on duty. William G. Hardy, a deputy sheriff for Jefferson County, was working off-duty security when he was shot twice in the head. The government brought charges against Johnson and Ardragos Ford. The first trials for both men resulted in hung juries. Ford was found not guilty after a second trial, while Johnson was found guilty and given the death penalty. Attorneys of Johnson claimed that providing $5,000 to a crucial witness without alerting the defense constituted a breach of due process.
Attorney Richard Jaffe has helped get 7 men off death row. Now he is working on an 8th. In 1998, DeForest Johnson was convicted of murdering Jefferson County Deputy William Hardy at a Homewood hotel. Jaffe represented Johnson's co-defendant, who was acquitted. He still feels Johnson is also not guilty.
There was no tangible proof, no eyewitnesses' accounts, no confession to the police. The sole witness for the state in the case claimed to have overheard a 3-way jail phone call in which a man going by name DeForest confessed to the crime. She had never met Mr. Johnson and was unfamiliar with his voice.
For sure, 100% sure, that he was innocent. There wasn't any question.
Jaffe said the key to the prosecution's case was testimony from a woman who claimed she heard Johnson's confession.
Overheard, allegedly, DeForest Johnson talking on a jail phone, saying something that was completely different from the forensic evidence.
But the jury found him guilty because of her testimony. The district attorney of the county where Johnson was found guilty, campaigners, and a number of former judges have demanded that Johnson's death sentence be reviewed. DeForest is now 50 years old. John Michael Ward, 24 years on death row. Michelle Milner Ward called the Baldwin County 911 Center at 7:28 a.m. on April 22, 1997, to report that her infant was not breathing. The Ward's travel trailer home was reached by paramedics 10 minutes later. While en route to the South Baldwin Regional Medical Center, the paramedics tried to revive Nicholas Ward via intubation after receiving his body from John Michael Ward. Dr. Robert Revel, the emergency room's attending physician, examined the child and found that he had rigor mortis, he was cold to the touch, he was not breathing, and had no pulse. When he arrived, the doctor declared the infant dead. Dr. Revel noted the absence of vital signs, abrasions on Nicholas's scalp, nose, and mouth region, pus-like material in his eyes, blood in his ears, bruises on his neck and chest, feces in the diaper, a deformity on his right arm, and crusty material in certain nail beds. Dr. Revel spoke with both parents following the assessment. The baby developed breathing issues, according to Nicholas's father, who claimed that a folding chair had fallen from a shelf and hit him in the head. The father did not believe it was necessary to call 911, despite the mother's desire to seek medical assistance. During the performance of the final rites, the mother seemed distressed, but Ward was impassive. According to Michelle's testimony, when they first started dating, Ward put his hand over her mouth and threatened to suffocate her. Throughout their marriage, Ward beat his wife violently. In the early hours of April 22, 1997, Ward suffocated to death his 4-month-old son after causing him multiple wounds. Ward is now 59 years old. Please remember to hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. Thank you. Marcus Bernard Williams, 24 years on death row. Williams had been out with pals on November 6, 1996, enjoying alcohol and pot. When he got home that night, his thoughts started to gravitate to Melanie Down Rowell, a young neighbor. Williams tried to get in Rowell's back door at 1 a.m., but the door was closed. Alongside the door, he suddenly observed the kitchen window. When he took the window screen off, he discovered that the window was not locked. He was able to enter the residence through that window. To reach the stairs leading to the upstairs bedroom, Marcus Williams passed through the kitchen. He took a knife out of a set that was in a knife holder on the kitchen countertop. He also took off his pants before going upstairs. He entered the upper room after passing through a baby gate that separated the steps from Rowell's 2 young children, aged 2 and 15 months. Williams entered the kids' room and discovered both of them sound asleep. He then went into Melanie's room. He climbed into bed on top of her, and a struggle started when he tried to take off Rowell's clothes. Williams had a knife, but Rowell fought him and screamed. He tried to take her clothes off once again while covering her mouth with his hand to keep her quiet. Williams encircled Rowell's neck as she fought on. Rowell eventually stopped resisting as he proceeded to choke her. Williams started to essay her when she stopped moving, and he continued for 15 to 20 minutes. The elderly female victim of a second break-in in the Asheville region was able to identify him, leading to the criminal's later arrest. He confessed to his role in Melanie Rowell's death in a statement he made after being taken into jail for that violation. He is now 48 years old. James Allen Johnson, 24 years on death row. Rodney Early found Lawson's body slumped behind the counter of the BP patrol station on Old Highway 78 in Jasper on August 5, 1995. She had been shot in the head and was still awake. Lawson passed away before the ambulance could get there, according to Early's testimony. Ira Morris, James Johnson's co-defendant, stated in court that he met with Johnson a few weeks prior to the robbery to discuss their intentions to rob and kill the BP station worker in Jasper. The two decided that Johnson would carry out the robbery and Morris would serve as the lookout. According to Morris' testimony, James Johnson walked up to the counter pretending to buy a drink and then put his crumpled money to the ground for the cashier to pick up. To grab the cash, Lawson knelt down. When she stood up, Johnson was holding a .38 caliber handgun at her head. He asked for money. Johnson shot the register clerk 4 times after Lawson handed him the cash. Morris claimed that he cleared the door of all traces of fingerprints before leaving during the shooting. The two got together the following day to divide the $447 that had been taken during the robbery. Morris claimed in his testimony that he was remorseful for his actions and so refused to accept any of the money. Johnson is now 50 years old. Geoffrey Todd West, 24 years on death row. Geoffrey Todd West and his girlfriend traveled to the Harold's Chevron in the late hours of March 27, 1997, or the early hours of March 28, 1997. This convenience store had previously employed him. He had earlier told others that he intended to loot the Chevron store, murder the person up there, and leave no witnesses. West entered the business brandishing a .45 caliber revolver, and he held store clerk Barry at gunpoint while stealing $250 from a cookie tin where the store's cash was kept. According to the medical evidence, Barry was shot in the back of the head when he was prone on the floor behind the store's counter. The wound would induce fast incapacitation and a very speedy death, the medical examiner claimed. West is now 48 years old. Melvin Jean Hodges, 24 years on death row. On the side of County Road 26 in Macon County, 2 hunters found Beth Seaton's naked body on January 5, 1998. The coroner testified that Seaton had several blunt force injuries to her head, neck, chest, and abdomen, with the crushing injuries to her chest and abdomen from being ran over by a car being the most serious. Seaton died as a result of these injuries. Her back had vertical tire prints running up and down. Near Seaton's body, a name tag from the Golden Corral restaurant was discovered with Hodge's name on it. Hodge and Seaton worked together at the Opelika Golden Corral restaurant. The restaurant's closure was one of Seaton's responsibilities as a supervisor. Hodge oversaw the staff. Police found Marlowe Murph after an investigation. Hodge allegedly proposed robbing the Golden Corral according to Murph's testimony at the trial. When they got to the restaurant, they noticed Seaton leaving in her vehicle. After pursuing the van, they succeeded in getting Seaton to stop. Murph claimed that while Hodge was speaking to her, he entered the van and pointed a gun at her. The two then coerced her into returning to the Golden Corral so they could forcibly open the safe. Seaton was then made to maneuver her van around the area by Murph and Hodge. Seaton knew far too much, according to Hodge, so he took her out of the van and started choking and punching her. Murph testified that he left when he saw what Hodge was going to do. He claimed that after taking the wheel of Seaton's van, Hodge ran the woman over roughly 4 times back and forth. They took her car and then they ran away. Hodge is now 53 years old. Bobby Wayne Waldrop, 24 years on death row. Bobby Waldrop was born to a mother who was only 14 years old and frequently abandoned him for days or weeks at a time. He spent a large portion of his formative years with Sherelle and Irene Prestridge, his maternal grandparents. They were reportedly quite close. The Prestridge's house was where Mr. Waldrop and his wife Clara resided when he was 19 years old. Sherelle and Irene were both sick and incapable by that point. Sherelle struggled to walk and had heart and hip troubles. Irene was bedridden and blind. The couple had transformed their living room into a bedroom with 2 hospital beds due to their ailments. Bobby Waldrop and Clara checked into a hotel after leaving the Prestridge's house on April 5, 1998, and Mr. Waldrop smoked an unknown quantity of crack cocaine there. They both returned to the Prestridge's house later that evening with the intention of robbing money to acquire more drugs. Mr. Waldrop and his grandfather Sherelle started squabbling over money shortly after the pair arrived. After that, Bobby Waldrop killed Sherelle by stabbing him 43 times, while his grandmother Irene begged him to stop. Irene assured her husband that she loved him and would see him in paradise as Sherelle passed away. Bobby Waldrop went to his vehicle after killing Sherelle and took some gloves out of the trunk. He went back inside and gave Clara the order to murder Irene. Irene was twice cut and stabbed by Clara, but she was unable to complete the attack. Then, after taking Clara's knife, Mr. Waldrop stabbed his grandma 38 times. Irene told Mr. Waldrop that she loved him before she passed away. The pair was apprehended the next day. Waldrop is now 45 years old. Keith Edmund Gavin, 23 years on death row. Gavin was found guilty of killing William Clinton Clayton Jr. in 1998 and robbing him in front of a Regions Bank Center, Alabama. After completing his daily deliveries, Clayton, a contract carrier for Corporate Express Delivery Systems Incorporated, was shot and killed while waiting outside the bank in a business van. According to reports, he had pulled over to use the ATM to get cash so he could take his wife out to supper. 2 different eyewitnesses, including his cousin Dwayne Meeks, a worker at the Illinois Department of Corrections, identified Gavin as the gunman. Less than 3 months had passed since Gavin's release from jail following a 16-year sentence for the Chicago shooting death of an unarmed man when the murder in Center occurred. Gavin is now 63 years old. Daryl Turner, 23 years on death row. Barbara Wilson's naked body was found in her Limestone County house on February 21, 1996, by her daughter Angela Anderson. Wilson was killed by suffocation, according to the coroner's testimony. There was proof that she was essayed before she passed away. Both Wilson's 1993 Cadillac and the 19-inch Orion television were gone from her home. Angela Anderson left her 2-year-old daughter Rosalind with her mother in order to accompany a sick friend to the neighborhood hospital. Anderson tried unsuccessfully to get in contact with her mother later in that day. She suspected her mother might have left her a note while she was at work, so as she walked up the driveway after leaving work to return to her mother's home, Rosalind sprinted out, claiming that her grandma was sleeping. Wilson's body was discovered by Rosalind and Anderson in one of the house's bedrooms, where it was discovered that Wilson had died. Turner was found guilty of robbing and murdering Wilson, accompanied by 2 other friends of his. He is now 49 years old. Gregory Charles Clark, 23 years on death row. He was convicted of stabbing and murdering someone during a gas station robbery. William Fuller Ewing was discovered dead at his convenience shop on Valentine's Day 1998 on the Fort Morgan Peninsula in Gulf Shores. $14 in gasoline was taken from a pump outside the business, but after an inquiry, more than $600 in cash was still in the victim's pocket. The autopsy on Ewing was carried out by Dr. Leroy Riddick. The victim sustained 15 stab wounds, 17 superficial cuts, and several scrapes on his body, including his back, chest, face, arms, and hands, according to testimony. Due to the presence and volume of blood in each incision, according to Dr. Riddick, Ewing was alive when each wound was inflicted, and the wounds were most likely made by a knife. Ewing and his murderer, Clark, have known each other for 10 years at that point. Clark is now 65 years old. Alan Eugene Miller, 23 years on death row. He shot 2 co-workers dead in their office, then murdered a third person at a business he had previously worked for. He was apprehended shortly after the shootings when authorities forced him to stop after seeing him on the nearby Interstate 65. He got into a quick fight with the police. In the shooting murders of co-workers Lee Holbrooks, 32 years old, and Scott Yancey, 28 years old, at Ferguson Enterprises, as well as Terry Jarvis, 39 years old, at Post Airgas, Miller pled not guilty due to mental illness or defect. Miller drove a truck for Ferguson, and up until January he worked for Post Airgas. Jarvis was a Post Airgas supervisor. Holbrooks and Yancey worked for Ferguson. Miller was fired from Post Airgas in January and was driving a Ferguson truck at the time of the incident. According to a buddy of Holbrooks, Miller was upset because he believed another driver, Holbrooks, was getting longer and better routes than he was. According to reports, Miller had a history of altercations with co-workers and had once been dismissed for fighting at work. The Birmingham News reported that Miller frequently engaged in yelling matches with one of the 3 individuals he is accused of killing on August 5 based on interviews with his former co-workers and bosses. Miller was also a dedicated worker who kept to himself, according to his former co-workers as well. He is now 58 years old. Jeffrey Lee, 23 years on death row. With a hidden shotgun, Lee entered Jimmy's pawn shop in Orville on December 12, 1998. Elaine Thompson and Helen King, 2 employees, as well as Jimmy Ellis, the owner, were shot by Lee. Ellis died from a gunshot wound to the chest, and Thompson died from a gunshot wound to the face, according to the coroner's testimony. King, who had also been shot, recovered and provided testimony during Lee's trial. King claimed that he pulled a shotgun and shot Ellis, Thompson, and her. She stumbled to the ground before acting lifeless. Lee departed the shop, and King claimed that after getting up, she called emergency 911 and shut the store's doors. She claimed that Lee attempted to enter once more, but departed when saw the doors were shut. The events were also captured on camera by surveillance. The videotape, which proved King's account, showed Lee shooting the victims. Although Lee admitted to shooting and killing the pawn shop's occupants, he claimed the first shot was accidentally discharged. Lee is now 47 years old. James Donald Yeomans, 22 years on death row. He was convicted for the murders of his ex-wife and her parents. This crime was very hard to read about, as the majority of the events unfolded in front of 4 kids. They saw their grandparents and mother being severely beaten, and then they heard the gunshots that killed them. Jake and Sylvia Simmons were the grandparents, and Julie was the wife. All 3 of them had autopsies performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Alfredo Paredes. Jake Simmons sustained many blunt force traumas to his face, as well as to the top and rear of his skull. The numerous fractures in Jake's face bones caused the left side of his face to half collapse. Jake was shot at least once through the face and the head, in addition to getting defensive wounds to his right hand. He was still alive when all of the wounds were administered because of the bruises around the wounds. Sylvia Simmons allegedly sustained numerous cuts, fractures, and bruising to the inside of her brain as a result of the wounds. Sylvia was reportedly hit on the head at least 10 times. At least some of the head wounds Sylvia sustained occurred while she was still alive, and she also received a bullet wound to the right cheek, which exited through the back of her head and lodged in the left side of her brain. A severe hit to Sylvia's left wrist resulted in a fracture and the malformation of both wrist bones. The wrist wounds were defensive wounds, according to Dr. Parades, and they were consistent with the size of the metal pipe that was found at the site. Sylvia also had defensive wounds to the back of her right hand, right arm, and wrist. Both a gunshot wound to the face and blunt force injuries to the head contributed to Sylvia's demise. Julie was shot numerous times and had her skull smashed. One of the bullets entered Julie's neck on the right side and exited the body through the rear of her center chest. Another bullet brushed her face and went through her earlobe. Another one went through her right cheek. A third one went through her right temple. Julie's brain contained shards from 2 of the bullets. She also had gunshot wounds in her mouth and right eye. Dr. Parades believed that Julie had been shot multiple times but had always been alive because there was bruising around the entrance wounds. Yeomans is now 60 years old. Cuauhtemoc Peraita, 22 years on death row. Peraita was incarcerated for the rest of his life without the possibility of parole because he killed 3 people during a heist at a Popeyes restaurant. In a prison in Alabama, Cuauhtemoc Peraita and 2 other conspirators would kill another prisoner by stabbing him. The victim's body underwent an examination by Dr. Leroy Riddick, a medical examiner with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences. The prisoner's name was Lewis, and he sustained a total of 18 different wounds, including 6 stab wounds. His carotid artery was severed by a single stabbing to the neck. A lung collapsed as a result of another chest stab. In addition, he had multiple superficial cuts and scrapes. Dr. Riddick came to the conclusion that knife wounds and cuts caused by sharp force injuries were the cause of death. Peraita is now 47 years old. Donald Deerdorf, 22 years on death row. Ted Turner was a Unity Church minister, a businessman who owned a warehouse and rental buildings, and the father of 2 kids. He disappeared in September 1999. After Millard Peacock, a co-defendant of Deerdorf, helped investigators looking into Turner's disappearance and directed them to the body, Turner's decomposing remains were found in a rural part of Baldwin County in July 2001. Turner had rented a storage facility to Donald Deerdorf and Christy Andrews starting in 1998. At some point, Deerdorf stopped paying the warehouse's rent, and Turner filed a lawsuit in district court against Deerdorf and Andrews. After the couple was kicked out of the warehouse, over $3,000 default judgment was rendered against them on July 27, 1999. Turner was attempting to confiscate some assets through the court procedures because Deerdorf and Andrews had left a number of disassembled automobiles, vehicle components, and tools in the warehouse. This was the motive for which Deerdorf decided to rob and murder Ted Turner. Deerdorf is now 58 years old. Anthony Eugene Brown, 21 years on death row. Virginia Keel, 83 years old, was strangled with a piece of fabric on June 19, 2000, and had cloth and tape placed over her lips and nostrils. Anthony Eugene Brown was responsible for Mrs. Keel's death. This violation took place at 22 Trillium Circle, apartment 1007, Dothan, Alabama, while Anthony Brown was breaking into Virginia Keel's house without permission. The police was called to the scene by a neighbor who saw something that made him think someone was in trouble in that apartment. When Corporal Heath and Officer Youngblood entered the apartment, they saw a black man in the kitchen area. The man said, "You've got me, you've got me. She is only restrained in there. I did not harm her." The man was then restrained by Officer Youngblood using handcuffs. This man was Anthony Eugene Brown, and he was then put in the back of Officer Gill's patrol car. A senior woman named Virginia Keel was lying on the floor when Officer Youngblood entered the bathroom. An extension cord was wrapped around Mrs. Keel's hand roughly 6 times before being manipulated in a knot. There was only one strand of cable connecting Mrs. Keel's wrists to her feet, and it was too short for her to extend her legs. Her mouth was stuffed with a piece of a t-shirt, and her head was around 15 to 20 times wrapped in a black duct tape. Mrs. Keel's neck was wrapped in a single knot made from the remaining t-shirt material. She was given CPR right away by the officers, who continued until paramedics came. Mrs. Keel received advanced life support from the paramedics, who then transported her to the Southeast Alabama Medical Center. Dr. David Williams started treating Mrs. Keel as soon as she got to the hospital. He diagnosed Mrs. Keel as being in status epilepticus and started her on anti-seizure medication. Mrs. Keel was not breathing and had a dismal prognosis. She passed away on June 29, 2000. Brown is now 48 years old. Wilson Billy Robitaille, 21 years on death row. Robitaille traveled from Phoenix City, Alabama to Hamilton, Alabama early on May 11, 2001 to commit a home invasion on a couple he had met while residing there in the late 1990s. He believed he knew where the jewelry was stored in the home of this couple because he ran a jewelry store. He waited for the couple to leave the house, but the man did not exit the premises, so he decided to find someone to lend him the money to go back home. He actually did meet someone that was able to help him out, but he was too proud to ask. He eventually found himself at the residence of Stuart Taylor, his wife Alyssa, and their 2 kids. He had previously worked for the Taylors and had even stayed in a camper in their backyard while repairing their home. The Taylors were people he knew quite well. Alyssa Taylor opened the door for him after he knocked on the kitchen door of the Taylors' residence. When Alyssa left the room to take care of the kids, they were seated at the kitchen table and having a conversation. Robitaille went over to Alyssa's handbag on the counter while she was away to grab the money he needed to buy gas to drive back to Phoenix City. Once more, he was too proud to ask for help. She unexpectedly returned to the kitchen and discovered what he was doing as he was in the middle of searching through her purse. She approached him quickly in an effort to stop him. Robitaille started using a Leatherman's or other multifunctional tool to stab Alyssa Taylor. She made an effort to flee by sprinting to a different room. When Robin, her daughter, started screaming, Robitaille followed her and grabbed a steak knife to pursue her. Robin managed to escape the kitchen through the carport, but Robitaille managed to catch her and bring her back inside. He followed her into her bedroom and stabbed her till she was dead after breaking the blade of one steak knife off in her back. After that, he headed upstairs to where Trent and Alyssa were. He was questioned by Alyssa about his motives. He responded by saying he had already gone too far. He continued stabbing her until she was lifeless and dying on the ground. Trent had been instructed by his mother to hide in a storage space behind the door in the bedroom, but Robitaille tracked him down and fatally stabbed him. He then went back outside into the hallway and apologized to Alyssa, but she could not speak anymore. Since some of the stab wounds did not flow, suggesting no blood pressure at the time they were inflicted, it was established that he went back to each victim and stabbed them again to make sure they were dead. He then proceeded to steal knives, scissors, coin-filled flasks, and Alyssa's purse and its contents. He then took off for Phoenix City, where police caught up with him. When Stuart Taylor returned home on May 11, 2001, he found the bodies of his wife and daughter. Later, cops located his son's body as well. Dr. Joseph Embry testified that Alyssa had received 18 stab wounds, Robin had received 17 stab wounds, and Trent had received 10 stab wounds. Robitaille is now 57 years old. Rex Allen Beckworth, 21 years on death row. Bessie Lee Tweet, the victim, was at home on the evening of January 5, 2000. The 87-year-old woman had resided in the same house for the past 67 years. She weighed about 112 pounds and she had a reputation for keeping cash in both her house and her car. The Tweet residence was broken into by Rex Beckworth and his stepbrother James Earl Walker on that night. The phone lines to the house were down and the exterior carport light was broken. The attacker shattered the house's back window to gain entry. Later, inside Mrs. Tweet's plundered home, Mrs. Tweed's body was found covered in blood and she was pronounced deceased. Beckworth is now 56 years old. Willie Earl Scott, 21 years on death row. At 19 years old, Willie Earl Scott resided with his grandmother. The home was also occupied by 10-year-old Latonia Sager, her younger sister, and their mother, Latrice Sager. There also resided Latrice's brother Albert, his partner Shanika Scott, and their 2 kids. Scott and Shanika were cousins. When Scott's grandmother awoke during the night of September 11, 1999, she witnessed Willie Scott leaving the house in a Lexus car that had been parked outside. Albert was looking for a broom downstairs the following morning. He was instructed by Latrice to check Latonia's chamber. Latonia's chamber door was locked, and when Albert pounded on it, she did not respond. Latrice and Albert entered the room when Albert unlocked the door. Latonia was partially covered by a sheet and appeared to be sleeping on her stomach. When Latonia's foot was touched by Latrice, she felt the coldness. Latonia was gone. After that, Latrice discovered that both her rifle and the Lexus were missing from their respective locations in her bedroom and driveway. Scott went on to essay another girl multiple times before she was able to escape and call the police. He is now 43 years old. Alfonso Morris, 20 years on death row. Court records state that he broke into the home of Miriam Rochester, who was 85 years old, and beat her to death. According to the testimony of the first officer on the scene, the door showed pry marks which indicated forceful entry. Some of the jewelry that was recovered from Morris's possession was recognized as the victim's by Rochester's granddaughter. Rochester's blood was identified on Morris's foot, and Morris' DNA was discovered on a cigarette butt that was discovered in the Rochester's home. Morris is now 62 years old. Rick Allen Belisle, 20 years on death row. When Rick Belisle and his wife looted the convenience store where she once worked, Joyce Moore, the clerk, was shot and she died. Joyce Moore was attacked by Rick Belisle. He used a huge can of peas and a metal pipe from an electrical fan stand to severely beat her. Before she passed away, the victim went through excruciating pain and suffering. Belisle repeatedly hit the woman with the metal pipe as she stood up on her arms to beg for help after she had been beaten until she was bleeding to death and lying face down on the ground in her own blood. This prevented her from standing up because her arms were under her and she was unable to move. Following that, Joyce Moore's injuries from Rick Belisle's assault caused her death. Annette consented to provide testimony against her husband Rick Belisle in exchange for a 20-year sentence. In her testimony, Annette stated that her husband and her were both out of job, broke, and unable to purchase food prior to the murder. He is now 54 years old. Michael Jerome Lewis, 20 years on death row. Lewis was found guilty in 2003 of killing Timothy John Kay in 1997. James Anthony Free, a second guy, was also found guilty and given the death penalty, but his sentence was later changed to life in prison. Lewis, Free, Kay, and another individual proceeded to Lewis's mobile home in Houston County, according to court documents. Free and Kay got into a fight, and during the struggle, Free hit Kay in the head with a beer bottle and his fist. Lewis eventually joined in the altercation as well. After that, Free and Lewis got into a fight over who would shoot Kay. The severely wounded Kay was then shot twice in the head. Kay was brought into Holmes County, Florida, in the back of his pickup truck after crossing the state border. Then Lewis and Free dumped Kay's body into the river from a bridge over Highway 2. Later, Lewis and Free took Kay's truck back to Houston County, where they lit it on fire in a field next to Sonny Mixon Road. Lewis is now 70 years old. James Earl Walker, 20 years on death row. James Walker was the co-defendant in the trial of Rex Beckworth regarding the murder of Bessie Lee Tweet, 87 years old. The victim's autopsy was performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Alfredo Paredes. Due to the gunpowder residue on the victim's face, he concluded that she had been shot at close range. In addition, he found 3 cheek fractures and multiple facial lacerations. There were 9 blunt force trauma injuries in total, including 2 skull fractures. The gunshot wound to the victim's head occurred after the blunt force trauma injuries occurred, while the victim was still alive. Walker is now 44 years old. Oscar Roy Doster, 17 years on death row. After their escape from the Covington County Jail on November 4, 2002, Bobby Phillips and Oscar Roy Doster were found guilty of numerous offenses they had both committed together. The shooting death of Paul LeMaster was the worst of these atrocities. Phillips, who admitted to being the triggerman in that killing, was found guilty of 3 charges of capital murder and given the death penalty by the jury. Following his second escape from the Covington County Jail, Doster was charged with murder in the killing of Dennis Courtney in Fairfield, Texas. Doster is now 48 years old. Brandon Dion Mitchell, 16 years on death row. At the Birmingham Airport Inn, Roderick Burt fatally shot Dorothy Smith, 58 years old, John Aylesworth, 42 years old, and Kim Olney, 28 years old. Brandon Mitchell blamed Roderick Burt for the shooting, and Burt blamed Mitchell. Burt shot Aylesworth, according to the prosecution, and Mitchell killed Olney and Smith. Mitchell is now 42 years old. Kim Van Pelt, 16 years on death row. Sandra Van Pelt, a 40-year-old mother of 3 girls from Southgate, Michigan, died in 2004. Kim Van Pelt, a 45-year-old construction worker from Tuscumbia, was found guilty of her murder. He received a death sentence for the beating and suffocation of his wife of only 2 weeks. Shortly before his new wife's naked body was discovered on a roadside outside Hamilton on November 24, 2004, he purchased a $300,000 life insurance on her. Sandra Van Pelt met her husband in an online chat forum. He is now 62 years old. David Dwayne Riley, 16 years on death row. A judge gave David Dwayne Riley Jr. the death penalty for the 2005 murder of Scott Michael Kirtley, who was 38 years old. Kirtley perished during a robbery at Florence's Daddy's package store. He was shot to death. Defense arguments that Riley didn't intend to murder the man were rejected by the jury. Riley remained emotionless as a Lauderdale County Circuit Judge Mike Jones handed down the death penalty. He had earlier expressed regret to the victim's family. On the witness stand, Kirtley's mother pleaded with the judge to impose the death sentence. Riley is now 39 years old. Bobby Phillips, 16 years on death row. Following their escape from the Covington County Jail on November 4, 2002, Phillips was found guilty of a number of crimes that he committed alongside Oscar Roy Doster. The murder of Paul LeMaster by gunfire was the most heinous of these transgressions. A 12-0 jury verdict resulted in the death sentence for Phillips, who admitted to being the triggerman in that killing, and was found guilty of 3 counts of capital murder. He is now 60 years old. Randy Lamont Lewis, 16 years on death row. Taurus Frost requested a ride from his girlfriend Von Trichessa Davis on March 28, 2006, so they could meet Randy Lamont Lewis. Davis brought her 2 little children who were 2 and 3 years old. Lewis, however, shot Frost point-blank in the head as Davis was being forced into another car with 2 men. When Davis attempted to flee, Lewis ran over her. He abandoned Davis's car behind an empty Ansley home. The following morning, when a neighbor reported a suspicious vehicle, the 2 kids who had spent the night in the locked car with Frost's body in the front seat were discovered. Lewis is now 37 years old. Anthony Lee Stanley, 16 years on death row. Anthony Lee Stanley was sentenced for the 2005 death of Henry Earl Smith at the Colbert County Courthouse in Tuscumbia. Stanley was given a life sentence by the jury, but that verdict was reversed in a case that many consider to be one of the most violent ever in that county. Anthony Stanley was convicted of capital murder. Smith was invited to Stanley and Shelley's flat in Tuscumbia in June 2005, but the couple had the intention of robbing him. Smith was hit with a bat and stabbed more than 30 times. Shelley Stanley initially faced a charge of capital murder but accepted a plea agreement. She received a life in prison sentence instead. Anthony Stanley is now 57 years old. Jamie Ray Mills, 16 years on death row. On June 24, 2004, Mills was found guilty of the robbery and murder of Floyd and Vera Hill. The Hill family lived on County Road 54 in Gwynn, and according to court documents, Mills and his common-law spouse, Joanne Mills, traveled there with the intention of robbing the Hill family. Her 87-year-old husband of 55 years was taking care of Mrs. Hill, who was 72 and in terrible condition. In connection with the crime, Joanne Mills is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Jamie Ray Mills is now 50 years old. Roderick Byrd, 16 years on death row. In the shooting deaths of Kim Olney, 28 years old, John Aylesworth, 42 years old, and Dorothy Smith, 58 years old, on November 24, 2005, at the Birmingham Airport Inn, Byrd was found guilty. All three were executed style shot. Byrd said on the witness stand that Brendan Mitchell, a co-defendant, killed all three victims. However, according to the prosecution, Byrd shot Aylesworth and Mitchell killed Olney and Smith. Mitchell received a death sentence as well. Byrd is now 40 years old. Brent Edward Martin, 16 years on death row. Martin was found guilty of the murders of Daryl Maurice Carrillo and Johnny Randolph III. In the past, he was given 2 consecutive life sentences for escaping from the Russell County Prison and attempting to kill a guard. The gun that was in Martin's possession at the time of his arrest, according to evidence provided by the state, is where the bullet that killed Johnny was fired. However, testimony revealed that the bullet's caliber matched that of Martin's rifle. The bullet that was extracted from Carrillo was too extensively damaged to tell whether it has been shot directly from Martin's gun. In addition, the shoes Martin was wearing when he was caught matched a footprint discovered close to the bodies of Johnny and Carrillo. He is now 51 years old. Michael Wayne Reynolds, 16 years on death row. At the Martins' home on Tidmore Bend Road on May 25, 2003, Chuck Martin, 38 years old, his wife Melinda, 31 years old, and their 8-year-old daughter Savannah were all murdered. Reynolds was found guilty of their deaths. He reportedly visited the Martin residence to obtain cash. Chuck Martin, who suffered 11 stabbed wounds, was involved in a struggle in the kitchen, according to forensic findings. Melinda Martin resisted with her attacker before being stabbed 24 times in the bedroom, according to the forensics. Savannah Martin was stabbed 5 times because she was in the room when the murders took place, and Reynolds did not want to risk being identified. He is now 51 years old. David Philip Wilson, 15 years on death row. In Houston County, Wilson was found guilty and given a death sentence for the 2004 murder of Dewey Walker. Walker, who was 64 years old and a cancer patient, was discovered dead at his Dothan home after going several days without showing up for work. Wilson murdered Dewey Walker during a home invasion robbery. According to the authorities, Walker was strangled after being hit with an aluminum baseball bat. According to the prosecution, Wilson and 3 other people, Matthew Marsh, Catherine Corley, and Michael Ray Jackson, attempted to rob Walker of rare coins which they claimed were buried in a wall by attacking him in order to steal his customized van. Wilson is now 39 years old. Wakili Brown, 15 years on death row. He was given a death by lethal injection sentence by Circuit Judge Bo Hollingsworth for the murders of Cherry Jamison, 26 years old, and her mother, Dottie Jamison, who was 49 years old. Prior to his sentencing, Brown informed the court he was innocent and has continued to assert his innocence. Although several of the victims' families urged the judge to give Brown a life sentence without the possibility of parole, Talladega County District Attorney Steve Giddens expressed satisfaction with the verdict. In March 2001, Brown was found guilty of killing the women by beating them to death in the home they all shared. The women were hit in the head repeatedly with what looked like a hammer. He is now 48 years old. Mario Diane Woodward, 14 years on death row. Woodward was found guilty of killing Keith Hoots, a Montgomery police officer, during a traffic check in 2006. A judge imposed the death sentence notwithstanding a jury's 8-4 decision to sentence the defendant to life in prison. The shooting of an officer and the shot from a moving vehicle resulted in 2 capital murder charges. According to the Montgomery Advertiser's coverage of the shooting, Hoots was shot in the head, knocked to the ground, and then shot 4 more times. 2 days later, he passed away. After the incident, Woodward ran away to Georgia before being apprehended and brought back to Montgomery. He is now 50 years old. Donald Dwayne Watley, 14 years on death row. Pravinbhai Pete Patel was killed during a heist and Donald Dwayne Watley was found guilty. Kenneth McCall, an Austell Crosby joint venture employee, went to his worksite under a bridge in Mobile early on December 29, 2003, and found the victim's body lying on the ground next to the entrance gate. He dialed 911 immediately. Dr. Kathleen Estes, the state medical examiner, said that Patel had several injuries to his head, neck, chest, and shoulder before passing away from multiple traumatic injuries. The injuries to the man's face were consistent with a beating, the injuries to his neck were compatible with strangulation, and the injuries to his upper body were consistent with being run over by a car. Dr. Estes claimed that Patel's pants were around his neck. Near the victim's body, cigarette butts were discovered. One of the cigarettes had DNA that matched Watley's DNA. He is now 51 years old. Calvin McMillan, 14 years on death row. 2 years after killing a man in a Walmart parking lot and stealing his truck, a jury found McMillan guilty of murder in 2009. McMillan's attorneys explained to the jury during the sentencing phase how extremely trying his client's formative years and childhood had been. They described how McMillan endured physical and essay while growing up in an abject poverty. When he was hungry, they claimed, he would draw sandwiches on paper and consume the pictures. They also noted that before he became 18 years old, he had moved around more than 20 different foster homes. The jury in McMillan's case decided 8-4 to recommend a life sentence for the murder as an alternative to the death penalty, but the judge decided to impose the death sentence. He is now 35 years old. Kevin Andre Tolles, 14 years on death row. After brutally abusing a 5-year-old boy, Kevin Andre Tolles was found guilty of abandoning him and allowing his injuries to cause his death. Shalinda Glass, Tolles' girlfriend, reported her automobile as stolen in Albertville in December 2006, while the little boy, Jonte, was inside. Days later, Tolles was taken into custody. The plan to cover up the boys' murder turned out to involve the stolen car. In the trunk of the car, recovered at a house Tolles owned, was where his body was discovered. The youngster had been severely beaten, according to an autopsy, and had the injuries received medical attention, he could still be alive today. Due to a behavior grade from school that showed a straight-mouthed rather than a smiling countenance on a report card, Tolles beat the child. The jury recommended execution after Tolles was found guilty in December 2009. He is now 49 years old. James Scott Largen, 13 years on death row. In 2009, a court in Tuscaloosa County condemned Largen to death after finding him guilty of capital murder in the murders of his parents, Jimmy, 68 years old, and Peggy, 56 years old. On the evening of March 15, 2007, Peggy and Jimmy Largen were at home where they were shot numerous times with a .22 caliber rifle and their bodies were tossed down the steps leading to the cellar. According to the findings of the autopsy, both victims' deaths were brought on by close-range headshots. A few days after the killings, University of Alabama police located his parents' automobile close to campus, according to a story at the time by the Associated Press. At Largen's initial trial, the prosecutor claimed that he had no regrets about the murders. The jury's recommendation that Largen receive the death punishment was accepted by the judge. He is now 52 years old. Justin White, 13 years on death row. Justin White, who was already serving a life term without the possibility of parole for the essay and murder of a college student in 2006, received a death sentence for the essay and strangulation of a teenager that took place 4 months earlier. Jasmine Parker, 17 years old, was killed on July 11, 2006, and her mother discovered her dead inside their apartment in North Birmingham with a pair of jeans wrapped around her neck. The first victim was Syria Black. She was choked by White with his hands, who then used the belt from her jeans to finish her off, as he told investigators, and it took her 5 minutes to die, according to Assistant District Attorney Lane Talbert. Black was then placed in the trunk of White's car and driven to Bessemer, where he displayed her like a prize to the neighborhood drug dealers. He is now 36 years old. Timothy Scott Boyle, 13 years on death row. After being found guilty of killing Savannah White, his girlfriend's 2-year-old daughter, in 2005, he received the death penalty. Savannah White was lying in a coma on the early morning of her second birthday. Assistant District Attorney Carol Griffith testified during the Gadsden trial in 2009. She was unable to hear anyone wishing her a good birthday. The child's skull was not broken, despite the fact that she had been badly hit and pummeled in the head. The autopsy was performed by a forensic pathologist who testified that Savannah had bruises on her face, shoulders, and legs in addition to burns from cigarettes. Savannah's sister also gave a testimony claiming to have seen Boyle torture and burn her sister just before she passed away. The sister also had scars from what she claimed were burns caused by Boyle's cigarettes. He is now 40 years old. Ronnie Lynn Kirksey, 13 years on death row. In 2010, Ronnie Lynn Kirksey received a death sentence after being found guilty of murdering Cornell Norwood, the 23-month-old son of his girlfriend. The child's mother, Yolanda Norris, discovered her kid on the floor in a pool of blood, according to Deputy District Attorney Carol Griffith, who testified before the jury. According to Terry Ferris, a former Gadsden police investigator, Kirksey admitted to detectives that he had put a foot on Cornell and was standing directly on top of him. At the trial, however, he said that he just fell on the child. He is now 48 years old. Jesse Earl Schwing, 13 years on death row. Sean Adam Cook, a worker at a convenience store in Oxford, Alabama, was fatally shot by Schwing during a robbery in November 2008. After only 9 minutes of deliberation, an Anniston jury found Jesse Earl Schwing guilty of capital murder and theft of property. James Potts and Tiffany Culp, two other Weaver's residents, were charged in Cook's death with capital murder. James Potts and his wife Tiffany have entered guilty pleas. As part of the plea agreement, Potts has to serve 2 life sentences, but Culp will only have to serve a total of 10 years in prison. Schwing is now 37 years old. Michael Brandon Kelly, 13 years on death row. After being found guilty of killing and torturing Emily Milling of Leeds, Michael Brandon Kelly of Moody was given the death penalty. The 23-year-old Milling's body was discovered by a road in St. Clair County. Milling was allegedly battered and suffocated to death, according to witnesses. 2 unknown guys Kelly had met at work were to blame for the crime, he claimed. Before the verdict was handed down, Kelly's father, daughter, and the neighbor pleaded with Judge Jim Hill to save his life. Long-haul truck driver Kelly was detained on November 19, 2008, when federal marshals staked out a Days Inn in the Los Angeles suburb of Pico Rivera. After that, he was sent to Alabama for trial. He is now 43 years old. Ryan Gerald Russell, 13 years on death row. Russell was given the death penalty by Shelby County Circuit Judge Michael Joyner for the 2008 murder of his ward and cousin, Catherine Helen Gillespie, who was 11 years old. According to Joyner, the punishment met the requirement for the death penalty under the aggravating factors of being terrible, appalling, and cruel. According to the trial evidence, Russell shot the girl in the back of the head in the house they shared on Kerry Downs Road in the vicinity of Inverness. Russell shot her and then put her body in a plastic trash can that he put in the back of his SUV that was parked in the garage. Russell and Catherine Gillespie's relative, Tim Gillespie, praised Joyner's judgment as a just sentence and expressed his wish that it would be executed sooner rather than later. Before being given a sentence, Russell, who was dressed in an orange gel jumpsuit, was given the opportunity to speak, but he declined. He is now 50 years old. Michael Bragg Wolf, 12 years on death row. Wolf admitted to shooting his wife and 2-year-old son while making a 911 call. That evening, a guy reportedly told an emergency operator, "I just killed 2 people. My family. I need to go to jail." In the courtroom of Mobile County Circuit Judge Joseph Johnston, a jury listened to a recording of that call. He killed their 2-year-old son Aiden and 30-year-old wife Angel Wolf. Towards the end of the evening on March 5, 2008, the mother and son's bodies were discovered in a trailer of Schillinger Road. According to the prosecution, Michael Wolf became fixated on whether the toddler was really his own son and killed the 2 people on purpose. Wolf was obsessed on the question of whether Aiden was really his son after learning that his wife could have had an affair, according to Mobile County Assistant District Attorney Joe Beth Murphy. He was the boy's father with greater than 99% certainty, according to a paternity test. However, the defense claimed that Wolf accidentally shot his son before shooting his wife when he became angry of what had happened. He is now 45 years old. Courtney Laurel Lockhart, 12 years on death row. Burke, an 18-year-old freshman at Auburn University, was abducted by Courtney Lockhart while being threatened with a gun. Burke was robbed by dishonorably discharged U.S. military veteran Lockhart, who also made her strip naked. He talked about his unemployment and bad luck while driving her around 30 minutes. Lockhart shot Burke in the lungs as she tried to run. Burke was abandoned on Alabama State Route 147, severely injured and dressed only in a pair of socks. The fact that Lauren Burke was able to notify police that her purse and ID were still in the assailant's car and that she provided the basic description of the assailant and the vehicle enabled police to identify the offender fairly quickly. Unfortunately, she passed away at the hospital. Lockhart is now 39 years old. Bart Wayne Johnson, 12 years on death row. Officer Philip Davis was shot and killed in December 2009, and Johnson was found guilty on 2 counts of capital murder. Davis pulled Johnson over and issued him a speeding ticket in Pelham at around midnight, according to the evidence at Johnson's trial. Johnson then shot Davis in the face. Johnson argued that he was innocent due to a mental illness or defect. He had a brief psychotic episode when he shot Davis, according to testimony given at his trial by a psychologist hired by the defense. Given that it appeared the officer was making an effort to accommodate Johnson, his actions showed a callous disrespect for human life and a complete disregard for authority. Johnson is now 44 years old. Aubrey Lynn Shaw, 12 years on death row. After finding Shaw guilty of murdering his great-aunt and uncle at their St. Elmo farmhouse, the judge condemned him to death by lethal injection. In 2007, Shaw stabbed Bob and Doris Gilbert, 79 and 83, 50 times with a steak knife before looking through his great-uncle's pockets for cash and stealing 2 firearms from the property. It was a savage stabbing and slashing deaths of 2 very old and frail people. The victims' multiple defense wounds indicate that their deaths were likely drawn out and painful rather than immediate. Furthermore, they both endured the emotional anguish and dread of having to witness a spouse being savagely attacked with a knife while being unable to intervene physically. The Gilberts' property in South Mobile County used to be a horse farm where plenty of people came to ride horses for fun. Meanwhile, court testimony revealed that Shaw had been essayed by his grandmother when he was a young child and had developed a crack cocaine addiction as a teenager. He is now 49 years old. Corey Allen Wimbley, 12 years on death row. In 2008, Corey Allen Wimbley was found guilty of killing a business owner during an attempted robbery in Washington County. In connection with the shooting death of Connie Ray Witt, 55 years old, Wimbley was accused of capital murder. The death sentence was upheld by the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals in 2014. According to the available evidence, Wimbley prepared gasoline to bring to Harris Grocery, took a revolver, and even had an escape route. Wimbley packed a luggage and stole money from Ray Witt's pockets in addition to the cash register in order to travel to Tampa, Florida. He is now 37 years old. Tawan Towns, 12 years on death row. Christopher Woods was killed by Towns, who was committing a burglary. Towns intended to rob Woods, a reputed narcotics dealer. Woods shared a residence in Dothan with his girlfriend India Starks. In a car with Cornelius Benton, Towns arrived at Woods' residence on November 13, 2008. He was armed with a .22 caliber rifle, and Benton was armed with a pistol that belonged to Towns' brother. Benton repeatedly struck Woods in the face to coerce him into giving them money as he begged for his and Starks' lives. Towns used the rifle to shoot Woods in the chest, and Benton continued to strike Woods. After shooting Woods in the knee, Benton kept punching Woods in the face and yelling for money. "Man, don't do this," Woods yelled and begged. Starks overheard. Starks rushed to a neighbor's home after Woods was shot a second time to call emergency 911. She claimed that Woods was slouched in the chair, the room where the attack took place was looted, and her cell phone was stolen. Towns acknowledged that he and Benton went to rob Woods at his home because he was short on cash. He denied having any desire to murder Woods, though. He claimed that his goal was simply to frighten the victim. He is now 33 years old. Clayton Antoine Shanklin, 11 years on death row. In addition to being found guilty of murdering Michael Crumpton during a first-degree robbery, Shanklin was also found guilty of trying to kill Ashley Crumpton, Michael's wife. By a vote of 12-0 at the sentencing phase of Shanklin's trial, the jury recommended that he be given a life term without the possibility of parole. The circuit court overruled the jury's recommendation and sentenced him to death after receiving a present tense investigation report and holding a sentencing hearing. The court reasoned that the aggravating factors vastly outweighed the mitigating factors. Shanklin's request for a new trial was rejected by the court. He is now 38 years old. Jesse Lavelle Phillips, 11 years on death row. In 2009, Phillips fatally shot his wife, Erica Rose Phillips, and their unborn child in Marshall County. He was found guilty of capital murder and given the death penalty. It was the first case to be prosecuted and found guilty under Alabama's Brody Act, which classified killing an unborn child in an attack on the mother as homicide. On February 27, 2009, the shooting took place at an Alabama 69 car wash near Guntersville. After shooting his wife in the back of the head, Jesse Phillips left her body lying in a car wash bay. The next day, the 23-year-old passed away in a nearby hospital. According to court records, Phillips admitted to shooting the woman. He is now 44 years old. Nicholas Smith, 10 years on death row. In July 2013, Talladega resident Nicholas Smith was found guilty of capital murder in the death of Kevin Thompson, a 24-year-old teacher at Aniston's Wellborn Elementary School. Thompson was taken hostage by Smith and two other people, who then used a steak knife to stab him to death after taking him to an ATM and robbing him of $400. Smith is now 34 years old. Dante Callan, 10 years on death row. Callan was found guilty of capital murder in the stabbing deaths of his great-aunt Bernice Kelly, 59 years old, and his cousins Cortez Kelly, 33 years old, and Delia Budges, 12 years old, on October 29, 2010, and in the subsequent starting of fires in that flat. Callan was condemned to death in 2013. According to a court document, Bernice Kelly sustained 18 stab wounds, Cortez Kelly sustained 23 stab wounds, and Elia sustained 34 stab wounds. After the killings, Callan, who was 18 at the time, admitted his guilt to Birmingham police. In a bedroom within his aunt's apartment, Callan claimed to have been drinking beer with Cortez Kelly when he began stabbing her. Elia, who was staying at the flat because it was close to the prestigious school she attended, was dozing off on the couch as his aunt slept in her room. He is now 31 years old. Jerry Dwayne Bohannon, 9 years on death row. He was found guilty of shooting Little Jerry Dubois Jr., 24 years old, and Anthony Andy Harvey, 45 years old, on December 11, 2010, early in the morning outside the Paradise Lounge on Highway 45. Numerous witnesses testified throughout the trial, but video from 3 outside cameras that largely recorded the incident in issue served as a major piece of evidence. Bohannon insisted he was merely protecting himself throughout the trial because all 3 of the defendants had weapons. When the sentence was given, Bohannon, who was wearing a Mobile County Metro Jail uniform, showed no sign of emotion. He is now 61 years old. Jordan Stanley Creek, 9 years on death row. He robbed the restaurant where he also worked while shooting and killing night manager Jeffrey Mark Graff, 49 years old, and Jesse Jose Aguilar, 23 years old. Creek was given a death sentence by Circuit Judge Glenn Thompson in January 2014. Cassandra Ryan Eldred and Ezekiel Marquez Golston are the other 2 defendants in the case. Creek is now 33 years old. Cedric Jerome Floyd, 9 years on death row. Floyd received a death sentence for shooting Tina Jones to death. According to the news release, Floyd jumped through a bedroom window of the Joneses' residence after midnight in January 2011 and shot Jones in the back as she attempted to flee. He then shot her twice more in an execution-style manner. Jones was attempting to end a 2-year, volatile, on-and-off-again relationship. Just hours prior to the incident, Floyd had threatened Jones via mobile phone, writing, "Don't make me send myself to prison," and "Y'all going to hate you ever met me." By a vote of 11-1, the jury had recommended the death punishment. The fact that Floyd had previously been convicted of first-degree SA was one of the aggravating factors. He is now 41 years old. James Osgood, 9 years on death row. He was sentenced to die in 2014 after being found guilty in Chilton County of 2 counts of capital murder for killing Tracy Brown, 44 years old, in 2010 after having essayed her. Tonya Van Dyke, Osgood's girlfriend, was also found guilty in Brown's death and was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Brown was a cousin of the victim. Osgood's conviction was upheld by the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, but the sentencing was remanded due to a mistake in the judge's instructions to the jury during the penalty phase of the trial. They requested a new sentencing phase and remanded the case to Chilton County Circuit Court. Osgood informed his attorneys that he desired to forego the jury trial and return to the execution row. He said that he believed in eye for an eye and that he deserved to be executed when the judge questioned why he wanted to be sent back to death row. He is now 54 years old. John Joseph DeBlas, 8 years on death row. Heather Level Keaton and her common-law husband John DeBlas were convicted for the murder of their 2 children. Keaton was the stepmother to DeBlas's biological son and daughter, Chase DeBlas and Natalie DeBlas, who were killed 3 months apart. DeBlas is now 40 years old. Sherman Collins, 8 years on death row. Collins is on Alabama death row after receiving a death sentence for the murder of Detrick Bell. Bell was shot dead during a small-town rap performance. Collins argued that the judge who gave him a death sentence failed to take into account his difficult upbringing and absence of a father figure. The court rejected that argument. It also concluded that Collins' death sentence was consistent with other sentences given in situations like his. He is now 47 years old. Javon Dwayne Gaston, 8 years on death row. For the slaying of Kevin Thompson, Javon Gaston received a death sentence. The victim was abducted by Javon Gaston and Nicholas Smith, who we talked about earlier, and they made him drive to several ATMs and forced him to withdraw money before stabbing him to death. Gaston is now 35 years old. Dennis Hicks, 7 years on death row. He was given the death penalty by Circuit Court Judge Charles Graddick for killing and dismembering a man in front of his kids. The investigation into the case started in October 2011 when human remains were discovered at a location in West Mobile that was once used as a police shooting range. Joshua Duncan, a mentally challenged 23-year-old man who had been missing for a month, was confirmed to be the body. His body was allegedly disemboweled and had its head severed. Hicks, 53 at that time, was rapidly recognized as a person of interest in the investigation. He became friends with Duncan at church and was the last person to be seen with him before he vanished, claims a police investigator. Hicks was on parole at the time after spending 25 years in prison for a double homicide in Mississippi. An investigator claimed that in that incident, Hicks had shot and stabbed 2 victims before putting their bodies in a car's trunk. He is now 65 years old. Stephen Lindsay, 7 years on death row. A Gadsden man was found guilty of capital murder in the 2013 killing of his 20-month-old daughter by an Etowah County jury in less than 2 hours. Malia Tashay Lindsay was murdered in a ritual killing. She was killed by at least 6 blows to the neck delivered with a machete-like sword, according to medical testimony and horrific images shown to the jury. Close to the family's residence, detectives discovered her body in waste bags, and a few blocks away, they discovered numerous swords and long knives dumped in a forested area. When Lindsay was being arrested, he made a confession that was captured on camera and played to the jury later. He had pleaded not guilty due to a mental illness or defect. He is now 46 years old. Justice Knight, 7 years on death row. For the 2012 robbery, kidnapping, and shooting death of Jarvis Daffin, Justice Knight, then 21 years old, was found guilty. Near the village of Tumbleton, Daffin's dead body was abandoned in a remote area. Knight planned the murder to get access to the victim's tax rebate. He is now 32 years old. Ryan Clark Peterson, 6 years on death row. He was convicted for a triple homicide. According to individuals who were present the night of the event, Ryan Peterson, 24 years old at the time, spent the most of an August evening in 2012 at Teasers, drinking alone and behaving suspiciously. After a disagreement with an employee, club security allegedly ejected Peterson from the location. Cameron Paul Eubanks, 20 years old, Tiffany Page Grissett, 31 years old, and Thomas Robbins Jr., 59 years old, were all killed when Peterson returned shortly later carrying a handgun and started shooting. Additionally, he shot Scotty Russell, 33 years old, who lived despite his wounds. He is now 34 years old. Benjamin Young, 5 years on death row. For the 2016 murder of Kijana Freeman, a teenager from Tuscumbia, Benjamin Young has been given the death penalty. Freeman was slain on March 1, 2016, while he was inside a friend's Mustang that was driven by a 17-year-old outside of Spring Creek Apartments. In the shooting, the friend was also hurt. Young was found guilty of murder in the first degree, shooting into an occupied car, and capital murder. The death penalty was imposed by the jury on an 11-1 decision. Young is now 36 years old. Peter Capote, 5 years on death row. He was the second person convicted in the murder of teenager Kijana Freeman. The Colbert County jury decided to execute the defendant on a 10-2 vote. He is now 30 years old. Derek Dearman, 5 years on death row. In the early hours of August 20, 2016, a male attacker broke into a home in the 1700 block of Jim Platt Road west of Citronelle at around 4 a.m. 5 people who were asleep were slain by him, including 2 married couples and one that included a woman who was 5 months pregnant. Axes and firearms were among the many weapons that he used. He abducted Lanita Lester, his ex-girlfriend, along with the child of her brother and his wife, and brought them all to his father's home in Lakesville, Mississippi, which is about 30 miles to the west. He later let them go. Lester brought the child back to Citronelle, where she went to the police station and reported the murders. Derek Dearman turned himself in to the police after being persuaded to do so by his father. He is now 35 years old. Gregory Lance Henderson, 11 years on death row. He was sentenced to death for the murder of a police officer. In order to check for a switched tag violation, Anderson was attempting to stop Henderson off Lee Road 240 when Henderson started evading him. The deputy got out of his car and gave him a stop order, but Henderson hit the deputy with his Honda Civic. Anderson was crushed by Henderson after he floored the gas pedal, pinning the officer between the car and the ground where he was unable to breathe. Henderson is now 51 years old. Michael David Belcher, 4 years on death row. A court in Tuscaloosa County condemned Michael David Belcher to death by lethal injection for his part in the beating, torturing, and murder of Maplesville resident Samantha Pine, 29 years old, in 2015. In November 2015, Payne was subjected to beatings and torture by a bunch of pals who were high on meth. She had her throat cut after being tied to a tree in a secluded part of the Talladega National Forest. Belcher led the attack and performed the throat cutting on Pine. Later, the hunters found her body. Belcher is now 39 years old. Michael Anthony Powell, 2 years on death row. The jury's 11-1 recommendation that Michael Anthony Powell be executed for the execution-style killing of 54-year-old Tracy Letty Algar at the Alabaster convenience store, where she was well-liked and well-known by her patrons, was upheld by Shelby County Circuit Judge Bill Bostick. Algar was fatally shot in the Kirkland Chevron's restroom, and according to the authorities, she was shot in the top of her skull while kneeling. In the robbery, about $260 were stolen. Powell is now 51 years old. Christopher Henderson, 2 years on death row. He was given the death penalty for murdering his wife, Kristen Smallwood Henderson, and their unborn baby, her mother, her other child, and even her nephew. At the time of the murders, Kristen Henderson was 35 years old, and she was 9 months pregnant with her kid. Her mother, Jean Smallwood, was 67 years old, and her nephew, Eli Sokolowski, was 1 year old. Her son, Clayton Daniel Chambers, was just 8 years old. Authorities came to find the bodies inside a burning home in New Market. Henderson is now 48 years old. Michael Dale Yervolino, 2 years on death row. In connection with the shooting death of 20-year-old Nicholas Sloan Harmon, Odenville resident Michael Del Yervolino was accused with capital murder. The district attorney for St. Clair County was Harmon's father. A Moody police officer discovered 20-year-old Nicholas Sloan Harmon's body inside a wrecked car in November 2019 when driving up to it at the Valero truck stop on Kelly Creek Road. As crew chief for the Alabama National Guard, Harmon, also known as Boo, was ready to receive his pilot's license.
My name's Sloan Harmon. I'm a senior at Kelsey High School. I wrestle. Wrestling's a lot more than just a sport. You know, wrestling's one of those things that really lets you know where you are in life. It tests a lot of your mental and physical characteristics. You know, I've made so many friends over the past couple of years doing so, and I don't know anybody closer to me than my team. Wrestling has got me through school as far as keeping my grades up and just keeping me healthy, and I don't know what I would do without it.
Yervolino is now 36 years old. Donnie Lee Abernathy, 2 years on death row. In November 2015, at a house in the Round Mountain community of Cherokee County, Donnie Lee Abernathy is accused of killing 3 women and injuring a man. Abernathy shot and killed the victims, kidnapped his ex-girlfriend Jerrica Hamilton against her will from the house, tried to avoid the police, and then crashed his Ford Mustang moments afterwards. Abernathy came into the house, killed all 3 victims, grabbed Hamilton, and then instructed her to phone 911 and let them know everything was fine. If she didn't, he would kill her and he would make sure that she would never see her child again, according to Hamilton's account to detectives. Abernathy is now 46 years old. Brandon Dwayne Sykes, 1 year on death row. A West Alabama man was found guilty by a jury of capital murder in the death of his ex-wife, whose body has not been recovered since she was last seen 8 years ago. According to District Attorney Andy Hamlin, Brandon Sykes was found guilty in 2022 of killing Keisha Sykes, 29 years old at the time, and the jury chose to sentence him to death. In February 2015, Sykes, a mother of 3, vanished from her Vernon home. A few days later, her burned-out and abandoned car was discovered close to New Hope, Mississippi, but the woman's remains were never discovered. Detectives, however, did find her blood in the bed of Brandon Sykes' pickup truck as well as at her residence. He is now 42 years old. Jimmy O'Neill Spencer, 4 months on death row. Martha Dell Reliford, 65 years old. Marie Kitchens Martin, 74 years old, and Colton Ryan Lee, just 7 years old, died in 2018, and Jimmy O'Neill Spencer was found guilty of 7 charges of capital murder. The 74-year-old Guntersville grandmother and her 7-year-old great-grandson were allegedly killed by Spencer during a heist that netted just $13 in cash. In a recorded confession, Spencer admitted to killing Reliford for roughly $600 and then killing the child to get rid of a witness. The homeless criminal, who had 8 convictions dating back to 1984, including assault, robbery, and escape, was a dangerous offender fresh out of prison at the time of the killings. He is now 58 years old. John Russell Calhoun, 23 years on death row. John Calhoun broke into LP and Tracy Phillips' Talladega house on May 8, 1998, and shot Tracy Phillips to death. LP testified that on the evening of May 8, her neighbor called to let her know that a man was peering through her windows. LP informed Tracy, her husband, who then went to inspect the exterior. Calhoun, who had a stocking mask covering his face, was pursuing Tracy inside the residence while brandishing a revolver. According to LP, she recognized the man in the mask as Calhoun since he had visited their home that day, and she had also seen him earlier that day while she was putting up signs for a yard sale she was hosting. LP claimed that she quickly fled upstairs to one of the bedrooms, slammed the door behind her, and took cover there with her daughter and her friend. She claimed that a few seconds later, Tracy yelled from behind the door that Calhoun had a gun to his head and would shoot him if she did not open the door. She complied, and Calhoun went into the bedroom. In addition to offering him cash and jewelry, Tracy begged for their lives. Calhoun refused and instructed LP to undress, lay on the bed, and spread her legs. LP agreed. Calhoun squeezed Tracy's head between his wife's thighs, then pulled the trigger. Tracy's brainstem was severed as a result of a gunshot wound to the back of his head, according to the coroner's testimony. Calhoun pulled LP downstairs after shooting Tracy, where he essayed her and he also beat her. She claimed that when she fought Calhoun for the pistol and he lost his temper, he pointed the weapon at her and pulled the trigger, but nothing happened. After another essay, Calhoun ordered the woman to go upstairs and retrieve any cash she might have. She informed him that she did have jewelry in a downstairs bathroom, but refused to return upstairs since her husband's body was there. He received some jewelry from LP, dropped some of it, and then walked away. LP then dialed 911. Calhoun is now 55 years old. Robert Sean Ingram, 28 years on death row. Together with another two friends, Anthony Boyd and Marcel Ackles, he took revenge on Gregory Hughley in 1993 by burning him to death for a debt related to drugs. Boyd and Ingram were sentenced to death. Marcel Ackles was sentenced to life without parole. Ingram is now 52 years old. Donald Dallas, 28 years on death row. After compelling a woman to withdraw money from several ATMs, Dallas put her into the trunk of a vehicle. He left the vehicle with the woman inside the trunk, and she suffered a heart attack and passed away. He is now 59 years old. Patricia Blackman, 28 years on death row. Blackman was responsible for her adopted daughter's passing. Dominiqua Bryant had only just turned 2. On May 29, 1999, Patricia Blackman dialed 911 to ask for the dispatch of paramedics to come to her trailer in Dothan. Patricia Blackman informed the operator that her child was not breathing. Dominiqua was found unresponsive and laying on the floor of Patricia Blackman's mobile home at about 9:30 p.m. Eddie Smith, a paramedic in Dothan, testified. She was only wearing a diaper and blood-soaked socks. She had a hematoma on her forehead and blood all over her chest. The paramedics attempted to revive her before transporting her to the emergency room at Flowers Hospital. Blackman is now 54 years old. Tiara Capri Gobble, 17 years on death row. Gobble was held responsible for her 4-month-old baby, Phoenix Cody Parrish's death. On December 15, 2004, Phoenix was transported to the emergency room of the Southeast Alabama Medical Center in Dothan. He was not breathing and had no pulse. The autopsy found that Phoenix had suffered a traumatic head injury and that his skull had been cracked. Phoenix also had multiple bruises on his face, head, neck, and chest, as well as shattered ribs, a broken right arm, fractures in both wrists, and the tear in the inside of his mouth that appeared to have been caused by a bottle being rammed into it. When his mother was unable to put him to sleep, she lost her cool, and then the baby passed away. She is now 40 years old. Christy Michelle Scott, 14 years on death row. According to court documents, Scott intentionally set her home on fire, killing her 6-year-old autistic son. The fatal fire was actually started in her children's bedroom, according to the findings of the fire investigators. It's possible that Scott was attempting to file a claim with the insurance company. In the early hours of August 16, 2008, the Scott home caught fire and Mason died as a result. Dr. Emily Ward, a pathologist with the Alabama Department of Forensic Sciences, claims that Mason died from thermal burns and smoke in his airway. Mason was asleep alone in the children's bedroom, while Christy and her 4-year-old son were asleep in the room of Jeremy Scott. He was the father of Mason. She is now 45 years old. Heather Leavell Keaton, 8 years on death row. In 2010, Leavell Keaton was accused of killing her 2 stepchildren, Natalie DeBlas, age 4, and Chase DeBlas, age 3. Along with her partner, John DeBlas, the children's father, she perpetrated these crimes. Natalie was strangled to death in March 2010 after being duct taped, placed in a suitcase, and kept in a closet for 12 hours. Afterwards, her body was dumped in a wild area not far from Citronelle. In June 2010, Chase was fastened to a broom handle and left in a bedroom corner overnight, where he died from suffocation. His body was found in the woods close to Van Cleve, Mississippi. The reason why he died was because he simply asked about where his sister was. Keaton is now 35 years old. Lisa Carpenter Graham, 7 years on death row. Lisa Graham was held responsible for the murder of her daughter, Stephanie Shea Graham, who was 21 years old, by employing a family friend. The prosecution claims that Graham hated her daughter because she was a drug user, a stripper, and probably a sex worker who had dropped out of college. Graham believed that Shea and her husband were having an affair because they frequently took the same side in arguments, which was causing their marriage to fall. She is now 56 years old. With that, my friends, we reach the end of Alabama Death Row. See you next week with the stories of death row prisoners from another state. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.